Hey, welcome back, friend. Welcome back to Sleepy Old World. Pull up something soft. Get horizontal if you can. Dim whatever you can dim. Tonight we're going somewhere that most of us think we already know, and don't. Not really. Tonight we're talking about Victorian marriage. And before you settle in completely, before the lights go all the way down, I want you to sit with a few things I found while I was researching this, because the facts alone stopped me cold more than once, and I could not keep them to myself. In Victorian England, a woman's legal identity essentially disappeared the moment she married. Not metaphorically. Literally, under a doctrine called coverture, a wife and husband were considered one legal person, and that person was him. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts. If she had money before the wedding, it became his. If she earned wages after it, those were his too. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not keep her own children if the marriage ended, not automatically. Not without a legal fight she had almost no standing to win. And this was not some obscure edge case of Victorian law. This was the default. This was simply how marriage worked. For most of the 1800s, the wedding vow was also a legal surrender. In the 1840s, the average age at which middle-class English women married was around 23. Working-class women sometimes married younger. Upper-class women occasionally waited until their mid-20s, or later, depending on family strategy and the availability of suitable men. Girls as young as 12 could legally marry in England until 1929, when the minimum age was finally raised to 16. 12! That is not a misprint. And one more thing, because this one genuinely unsettled me. The wedding ceremony most of us picture, the white dress, the church, the flowers, the veil, almost none of that was traditional before Queen Victoria. She wore white to her own wedding in 1840, which was a personal choice, not a custom. Women had married in every colour before that: blue, green, grey, whatever they owned or could afford. Within a generation, white had become the only acceptable colour for a respectable bride. One woman's outfit rewrote an entire cultural expectation. That is where we are starting tonight. So, get comfortable. If you have not already liked the video and subscribed to the channel, a quiet moment now to do that would mean the world. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it keeps this little corner of nighttime history alive. Now, let us go back. Picture a morning in London. Let us say it is 1865. The year itself does not matter so much as the feel of it, the particular quality of a city that runs on coal smoke and propriety in roughly equal measure. The air outside carries the smell of horses and damp stone, and something faintly metallic that no one has ever bothered to name. The streets are already loud by 8 in the morning. But inside a townhouse in Kensington, one of those narrow 5-storey brick houses with white-painted bay windows and iron railings along the front steps, the sounds are different, quieter, more deliberate. Her name is Catherine. She's 24 years old. She's been married for 14 months. She's already awake, and has been for some time, lying still in the grey early light while her husband's breathing beside her settles into the deeper rhythm that means he has gone back to sleep. In a few minutes, she will ring for her lady's maid. The day will begin in earnest. The machinery of her life will start turning. The dressing, the breakfast, the calls, the management of the household, the 100 small performances that constitute, in 1865, being a wife. But for now she is just lying there, eyes open, looking at the ceiling. There is something in that image that I keep coming back to, the few minutes before the bell is pulled, before the day starts, before she has to be anything in particular for anyone. That is where we begin, to understand what Catherine's marriage actually is, what it feels like from the inside, what its rules are, what it asks of her every single day. We need to start before the wedding. We need to start with the question of how a woman like Catherine came to be married at all. Because in Victorian England, marriage was not just a personal choice, it was an institution, a legal contract, an economic arrangement, and a social obligation, and the process of arriving at it was governed by rules so elaborate, so specific, and so unforgiving that getting it wrong could affect a woman for the rest of her life. Let us start with the word that covers almost everything in the first chapter of this story: courtship. Victorian courtship, especially among the middle and upper classes, operated within a system so carefully constructed that it would not be unfair to call it a ritual. Every interaction between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman of good standing had to occur within certain boundaries. They could not be alone together, not really. Not for any meaningful length of time, not without a chaperone nearby. A young woman meeting a young man at a dinner party could speak with him, yes, could laugh and exchange pleasantries, could even discuss things of mild substance, travel, literature, the weather in the Lake District. But the conversation had edges, and she knew where they were, and she stayed inside them. The chaperone was almost always a female relative, an older sister, a married aunt, the girl's mother. Her presence was not incidental. It was the entire point. An unmarried woman seen alone with a man, in a carriage, in a garden, in a drawing room with the door improperly open, risked something that the Victorians treated with the same gravity that previous centuries reserved for property damage: her reputation. And a damaged reputation in 1865 was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a permanent alteration of her marriage prospects, which is to say her future, which is to say almost everything. Here is a small detail that I find remarkable. Letters between a courting couple were supposed to be written with the assumption that they might be read by her family. Not secretly intercepted, openly read, with full understanding on both sides that this was likely. A young man writing to a young woman he admired did not pour out his heart in the way a modern person might. He wrote carefully, correctly, with feeling held at a distance, because the letter was not just a private communication, it was a document being reviewed. And yet, love letters from the Victorian era that have survived in archives are among the most extraordinary pieces of personal writing you will ever read, because the people writing them knew the form they were supposed to follow, and they strained against it, hard, in every sentence. The emotion is there. It is just wrapped, coded, hidden in plain sight under layers of perfectly formal language. A young man writing to the woman he hoped to marry would say something like, "I find that the hours since last I had the pleasure of your company have passed with a slowness not entirely accounted for by the ordinary demands of the day." And any reader paying attention knew exactly what that meant. It meant, I miss you. Already. Badly. Now. How did a courtship actually begin? How did a young man and a young woman even come to be in the same room to begin with? The answer, for middle and upper class Victorians, was the social season. London's season ran roughly from late spring through early summer, May through July approximately, though the exact dates shifted with the years. This was the period when Parliament was sitting, when wealthy families came up from their country estates to their London townhouses, when the city filled with exactly the kind of people one was supposed to meet. Balls, dinner parties, at-home visits, which were afternoon calls paid to families at home for receiving guests, the opera, the theatre, promenades in Hyde Park on Sunday mornings, where people walked slowly in their best clothing and were seen. A young woman making her social debut, her first official entry into this world, was presented at court. Presented to the Queen, actually, or to a representative of the court. This presentation was called a drawing room, and the procedure was extraordinary in its precision. A young woman dressed in a white gown with a train of a specific minimum length, wearing white gloves and 3 white feathers in her hair, was escorted by a married woman of good standing to Buckingham Palace. She waited her turn in a queue of similar young women. When her name was called, she walked into the presence of the Queen or the Queen's representative, performed a deep curtsy, had her hand briefly touched, and walked out again, backwards, without turning her back, because one did not turn one's back on royalty. The whole thing lasted perhaps 30 seconds. But the point was not the 30 seconds. The point was that it happened. It was recorded. She was now officially out, launched into society, recognized as a marriageable young woman, her name written in the social register as someone's daughter who had been properly presented. The process declared her available, not in any crass sense, available in the sense of, the machinery may now begin, and the machinery did begin. Her mother, or the married relative sponsoring her debut, would begin manoeuvring carefully, ensuring the right people were invited to the right dinner party, ensuring that if a promising young man was to be at a particular ball, their daughter was also at that ball and was placed not too far from him during supper. This was not considered scheming. It was considered management, and it was done with tremendous skill by women who understood that their daughter's entire future depended on getting this part right. The young woman herself navigated this system with her own form of skill. She had to be appealing without being forward, interested without appearing eager, accomplished, playing the piano, speaking some French, being able to discuss a book or two, but never so accomplished that a man felt overshadowed. She had to be warm enough that a man wanted to spend time with her, but modest enough that her virtue was never in question. It was, in some ways, the most demanding performance imaginable, and it was expected to be invisible. The best managed courtship looked effortless. The most carefully orchestrated introduction appeared casual, and the young woman at the center of it had to be both the performer and the performance, simultaneously. Now, the question of who a young woman could marry was not open. There were rules, and they were social rather than legal, but that did not make them less binding. Class mattered enormously. A girl from a respectable middle-class family did not marry down without consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. She might marry up if she was beautiful or charming or both, and if the man's family was willing. But the most acceptable marriages were lateral. A young man from roughly the same social position, with roughly the same kind of family background, who would maintain or perhaps slightly improve her standing. Money mattered too, sometimes more than anything else. A titled family with a crumbling estate needed a bride with money. A wealthy merchant family needed the social elevation of a titled connection. The bargaining behind the scenes of an upper-class Victorian courtship was often nakedly financial, conducted between the men of both families, while the young couple sat in the drawing room and discussed, in their careful voices, the quality of the autumn weather. There is a piece of vocabulary from this world that deserves a moment: the word settlement. A marriage settlement was a legal agreement drawn up before a wedding that determined what would happen to a bride's money and property upon marriage. And recall what we said earlier, that under coverture, everything became her husband's the moment the vows were spoken. A marriage settlement was the negotiated exception to that rule. A bride's family might insist that a certain portion of her dowry be held in trust for her own use, or for the children of the marriage, in a way that the husband could not simply spend. These settlements were fought over by solicitors, sometimes for weeks, before a wedding could proceed. The romance of a Victorian engagement existed alongside, and sometimes in direct tension with, something that looked a great deal like a business merger. Catherine's own settlement, as it happens, secured her a personal allowance of £40 a year. £40, that is roughly what a junior housemaid earned in 2 years. It was not nothing. She could buy clothes, pay for small personal expenses, give quietly to charities she cared about. But it was also, in the context of the household she lived in, a deeply modest amount. Her husband managed thousands, she managed £40, and her household accounts, and the distance between those two numbers told you something about the architecture of the life. Let us talk about the proposal itself, because the rules around proposals were almost as elaborate as the rules around everything else. A man who had been courting a young woman and wished to formalize things did not simply ask her, or rather, he did ask her, but only after he had asked her father, or, if her father was dead, her guardian or eldest male relative. This preliminary conversation was understood by everyone as the real negotiation. The man presented himself, his income, his prospects, his family. The father considered. Questions were asked about the settlement. The father might say yes outright, or he might say he needed time, or he might say he needed to discuss it with his wife, or he might say, with varying degrees of gentleness, that the match was not suitable. If the father said yes, the man was then permitted to speak to the young woman herself. Notice that order. The father gave permission, then the woman was spoken to. The implication that her own feelings were secondary to her family's approval was not hidden or softened. It was simply the structure. She could refuse. A woman did have the right to say no to a proposal, but saying no came with its own costs. Refusing a suitable man without excellent reason was considered willful, even ungrateful. And in a world where a woman's financial security was almost entirely dependent on marriage, the freedom to say no was real but complicated. You could refuse, but you might live with the consequences of refusing for a very long time. What the proposal itself looked like, on the ground, in the parlour or the garden where it actually happened, that varied enormously. There are accounts in Victorian diaries and letters that describe proposals delivered with surprising passion, with genuine tenderness, with the kind of unguarded emotion that the formal rules were supposed to suppress. And there are accounts of proposals that were businesslike to the point of being cold, where a man made his offer with the affect of someone presenting a contract and the woman accepted with similar composure, and the whole thing was done in 10 minutes. What happened after the proposal, if she accepted, was the engagement, and the engagement was its own carefully regulated period, distinct from courtship, with different rules and different expectations. The couple was now formally promised to each other. The news was announced, in the newspaper, in letters sent to family and friends, at the dinner table of both families. The man was now allowed certain intimacies that had been forbidden before. He could visit the young woman unchaperoned, at least briefly. He could write to her directly and expect a reply. He might, in the privacy of a garden, or the corridor outside a drawing room, take her hand, perhaps press it, perhaps hold it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. By the standards of what would come after the wedding, this was still an extraordinarily constrained form of closeness, but by the standards of what had been permitted before, it was a revelation. Victorian engagement rings were often, though not always, a cluster of gemstones rather than a single diamond solitaire. That particular convention is, again, largely a later invention, driven partly by the De Beers diamond marketing campaigns of the 20th century. In the 1860s, a young man might give his fiancée a ring set with her birthstone, or with a cluster of small stones arranged in a flower pattern, or even with a locket rather than a ring at all. What mattered was the symbol. What mattered was that she was wearing something that announced her status to the world. The engagement period lasted, typically between 6 months and a year. A shorter engagement was considered hasty. A longer one could raise questions about whether the match was truly settled. During this time, the two families interacted with increasing closeness, the mothers arranging things together, the fathers meeting to finalize the settlement documents, the young couple writing the careful letters that were both private and not quite private. The bride's trousseau was assembled during this period too. The trousseau, the word comes from the French, was the collection of linens, clothing, and household items that a bride brought into the marriage. In a middle-class household, this was taken extremely seriously. The quantity and quality of a woman's trousseau was a statement about her family's respectability. Sheets and pillowcases embroidered with her new initials, chemises and nightgowns and drawers, dozens of them, carefully sewn and stored in trunks. Table linens for the household she was about to manage. Her own clothing, the dresses and gloves and hats and cloaks that would carry her through the first years of married life. The embroidery alone, the monogramming of all those linens, could take months. It was done by the bride herself, or by her mother and sisters and female friends, or by a combination of all of them. Sewing bees organized around a bride's trousseau were a common form of female social gathering in the months before a wedding. Women would sit together for an afternoon, stitching initials onto pillowcases, and in the rhythm of the work, in the privacy of a room full of needles and thread and women who liked each other, they would talk. What did they talk about? That is a question I keep coming back to. We know from diaries and letters that the conversation at these gatherings sometimes circled around the practical, advice about household management, about dealing with a cook who had a temper, about which shops gave the best credit. And sometimes it circled more carefully around the other thing, the thing that almost nobody discussed openly, what was actually going to happen after the wedding. The information that Victorian brides received about the intimate side of marriage varied wildly depending on their family, their social circle, and their individual luck. Some women were told almost nothing at all. There are diary entries, jaw-dropping ones, from women describing their wedding night as a complete shock, not just emotionally but physically, literally not knowing what was expected of them or why. Other women were given frank, specific, sometimes quite compassionate guidance by their mothers or older sisters. The range was enormous, and the consequences of landing on the uninformed end of that range were real and lasting. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The wedding has not happened yet. The wedding ceremony in 1865. Let us think about what Catherine's wedding actually looked like, because it was both familiar and, in its details, quite different from what we picture today. The wedding ceremony in 1865. Let us think about what Catherine's wedding actually looked like, because it was both familiar and, in its details, quite different from what we picture today. The preparations began weeks beforehand, not the dress alone, though the dress was considerable. The church had to be booked, which meant coordination with the parish vicar, who had his own requirements and preferences about the conduct of marriage services in his church. The banns had to be read. This is a word we do not hear much anymore, but the banns were a public announcement of the intended marriage, read aloud in the church on 3 successive Sundays before the ceremony, giving any member of the congregation the opportunity to raise an objection. If you knew of a reason the couple could not legally marry, if the man was already married, for instance, or if the woman was below the legal age, or if they were too closely related by blood, the reading of the banns was your moment. 3 Sundays, 3 chances. In practice, nobody objected. Objections at banns readings were extraordinarily rare and were remembered in a parish for decades when they did occur. But the ritual of the announcement existed, and it transformed the approaching marriage from a private arrangement between 2 families into a public event with a public dimension, something the community witnessed and in some sense ratified. The wedding morning, in Catherine's family home, began early and was almost entirely female. Her mother was there, her 2 sisters, her closest friend from school, who had travelled from Gloucestershire the previous day and stayed overnight, and the dressmaker, who had arrived at 7 in the morning to help with the final fitting and dressing, because Catherine's wedding gown, white silk, as Queen Victoria's fashionable influence had by now firmly established, had a construction complex enough that getting into it correctly required experienced assistance. The gown itself deserves a moment. It was not simply a white dress. It had a fitted bodice of white silk with a pattern of small woven flowers barely visible in the weave, a collar of Honiton lace, sleeves that fitted tightly to the elbow and then widened in a slight flare to the wrist, and a skirt that fell in the smooth, full silhouette of the 1860s, not the extreme crinoline of the decade's early years, which had been declining since about 1863, but still a substantial gathered skirt, supported by a crinolet, a smaller hoop worn at the back, to create the beginning of the bustle shape that would dominate the 1870s. The skirt had a train of modest length. The train mattered, too long, and it looked pretentious, too short, and it was hardly worth having. Her veil was also white, a length of fine silk gauze that her mother had worn at her own wedding, altered and freshened. This was the piece that made Catherine quietly emotional when she put it on, not the gown, not the flowers, not any of the accumulated ceremony of the morning. The veil. Her mother's veil. The particular thing that had been worn at the moment her parents had begun the life that produced her. Her bouquet was orange blossom and white roses, Orange blossom had been fashionable at weddings since Queen Victoria had carried it at her own, and by 1864 it was nearly ubiquitous at middle and upper-class weddings. Its scent, which is powerful and sweet and slightly waxy, would become one of those olfactory memories that does not fade. Decades later, the smell of orange blossom would stop her briefly, mid-breath, the way certain smells do. Her shoes were white satin, which she would never wear again after that day. Not because shoes were typically worn only once, but because white satin shoes had a specific formality that had no place outside a wedding. They would go into tissue paper, into a box, onto a shelf in the back of the dressing room, where they would sit for the next 40 years alongside the folded veil and a dried orange blossom she had taken from the bouquet and pressed between the pages of her prayer book. The church was St. Mary Abbots in Kensington, a church of some dignity, not grand in a cathedral sense, but solid, stone, and full of morning light on a June day. The family and guests had assembled. Edward was at the front, with his brother beside him as groomsman. The organ was playing something appropriate, unhurried, and then the doors opened, and Catherine came in on her father's arm, and the congregation rose. The service that followed was the standard Church of England rite, largely unchanged from the Book of Common Prayer. The vows are worth quoting, because their language shaped how Victorians understood the institution they were entering. Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honour and keep her, in sickness and in health, and, forsaking all other, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live? And to Catherine, similar words, but not identical. Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou obey him and serve him, love, honour and keep him, in sickness and in health, and, forsaking all other, keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live? Notice what is different. His vows required him to love, comfort, honour and keep. Hers required the same, with the addition of obey and serve. These two words, obey, serve, placed in the wife's vows and absent from the husband's, were not accidental. They were the theological expression of the legal doctrine made sacred by being spoken in church, in front of witnesses before God. You promised to obey. The promise was public. It was divine. It was permanent. There were Victorians who found this troubling, including some members of the Church of England clergy who thought the asymmetry was difficult to justify on strictly theological grounds. There were women who quietly removed the word obey from their vows, sometimes with the vicar's cooperation and sometimes without. This was considered very slightly radical, the kind of thing that might be discussed in certain reform-minded drawing rooms with something between admiration and unease. Most women said the whole thing, as written, as Catherine did, not because they did not notice the word, some of them noticed it very much, but because the weight of the moment, the solemnity of the church and the congregation and the music and the specific gravity of a wedding day made any deliberate deviation feel impossible. You said the words. You were married. The ring was placed on her finger. Edward's ring, gold, plain band, the one his mother had helped choose. She did not give him a ring. This was still a generation before the exchange of rings became standard for both parties. Only she wore one. Her ring announced her status to the world. His did not announce his, because his status in the relationship did not require announcement. After the ceremony, the register was signed. Both families witnessed it. The church bells rang. The congregation spilled out into the June sunlight. And then the wedding breakfast at her family's house, which has been described already but deserves one more specific detail. At some point during the reception, after the speeches, her father rose and made a toast to the bride. Not to the couple, to the bride. He spoke about Catherine in the past tense, not because she had died, but because the person she had been as a daughter of his house was now concluded. She was now her husband's wife, a new person legally. The old one, the daughter, the girl in the white satin shoes, had been, in the language of the toast, given away. She heard this and felt something she could not name on the spot, standing with a glass of champagne in her hand and a room full of people looking at her and smiling. Later she would think about it. She would write in the journal, eventually, that the toast had been beautiful and that she had been moved by it, and that she had also felt, at some point between moved and moved, the very slight sensation of a door closing behind her as she walked through. She was not certain the door had closed entirely. She hoped it had not. The church wedding was standard. The Church of England service was the expected form for middle and upper-class families, though nonconformists and Catholics had their own variations. The service itself was largely what it still is today: the vows, the exchange of rings, the declaration made before the congregation and before God. But the surrounding pageantry was different in ways that matter. The white dress, as I mentioned at the beginning, had become fashionable but was not yet universal. A woman of more modest means might marry in the best dress she already owned, or in a coloured dress specifically purchased for the occasion, expecting to wear it again on formal social occasions afterward. The idea of a dress worn only once and then stored forever was for most families a luxury they could not justify. The wedding party was often smaller than we imagine. Bridesmaids were usually close female relatives or friends, 2 or 3 of them, dressed in complementary colours but not matching ones. Matching bridesmaids' dresses are, again, a later convention. The groom's family occupied the right side of the church, the bride's the left. The father walked his daughter up the aisle and gave her away. That language, gave her away, was literal in its legal implications and widely understood as such. The reception afterward was usually a wedding breakfast held at the bride's family home, not at a separate venue. The word breakfast is slightly misleading because these events often happened in the early afternoon, but the Victorians used the word to indicate the first meal after the ceremony, regardless of the hour. There would be cold meats, fish, pastries, a wedding cake, the fruit cake covered in white sugar icing that is still associated with English weddings today, champagne, if the family could afford it, toasts made by the men about the bride and groom. And then something happened that is nearly impossible to imagine in our current era. The couple left. They actually left. Not at the end of a long evening of dancing, not after a reception that lasted until midnight. They left relatively early in the afternoon because they had a train to catch. The honeymoon was another 19th century invention, and it was considered essential, not optional, not a luxury, necessary. The couple needed time alone, away from both families, in a setting that was private and contained. Brighton was popular, the Lake District, sometimes Paris or the Swiss Alps for those who could afford it. 2 weeks was typical, sometimes 3. The honeymoon accomplished several things at once. It gave the newly married couple time to become acquainted in the ways that all the chaperoned courtship had prevented. It gave the families on both sides a period of transition, and it produced the kind of memories that the couple would be expected to reference fondly for the rest of their lives. What happened during the honeymoon, in practical, physical terms, was, as I mentioned, something that brides were often not well prepared for. Even in cases where a mother had spoken to her daughter before the wedding, the conversation had almost certainly been brief, possibly somewhat vague, and delivered in the tone of something that needed to be endured rather than enjoyed. The cultural message around women's intimate lives in the 1860s was complex in ways that historians have spent decades untangling. There was, on one hand, the official public stance, that respectable women did not have desires of that kind, that intimacy was a duty performed for the sake of the marriage and the production of children, that physical pleasure was something coarser women concerned themselves with. And on the other hand, there was the lived reality, which was considerably messier and more various than the official stance suggested. There were women who found the intimate side of marriage genuinely pleasant, who discovered in it something they had not expected and were glad of. There were women who found it distressing and never fully reconciled themselves to it. There were women who felt everything in between. What they all shared was the absence of any socially acceptable vocabulary for discussing any of it, which meant that whatever they felt, they largely felt alone. Catherine, standing on a railway platform in her travelling dress with her husband beside her and a small crowd of family throwing dried rice, knew almost none of what was waiting for her. She was 23 years old. She had been engaged for 8 months. She had kissed her husband twice, both times briefly, in the corridor outside the drawing room, while her aunt was in the next room. She was holding a small bunch of orange blossom that someone had pressed into her hand at the church door. The train came. They got on. And her life, in the form she would spend the next 40 years living it, began. Let us talk about the house. The first major task of a newly married Victorian woman of any standing was the house. Not her husband's childhood home, not the house she grew up in, the new house, the house that defined them as a married couple, that announced to the neighborhood and the social world what their income and status were, that would contain the next several decades of her life. For the upper classes, the house was often already established, an inherited townhouse in London, a country estate that had been in the family for generations. For the middle classes, the house was selected during the engagement or just after the wedding, and the selection process was not casual. The size of the house signaled income. The location within the city signaled respectability. The number of servants you could afford to keep in it signaled your class position to everyone who came to visit, including everyone who came to visit specifically to determine your class position. Catherine and her husband, his name is Edward, let us give him a name, moved into a townhouse in Kensington. 5 stories, a modest staff of 6, a cook, 2 housemaids, a lady's maid for Catherine, a manservant who also functioned as a footman, and a cook's helper who slept in the kitchen scullery and whose age was, when she arrived, approximately 14. The house had a front parlour for receiving visitors, a back parlour that the family used informally, a dining room, a library that Edward used as a study, a master bedroom on the first floor, and 3 additional bedrooms above it, a kitchen in the basement, and a servant's staircase running up the back of the house so that the domestic staff could move between floors without disturbing the family. The running of this house was Catherine's job, not Edward's, not the cook's, not the housekeeper's, although a woman in Catherine's position aspired to have a housekeeper, a senior domestic who managed the other servants on her behalf, and Catherine had one, a Mrs. Trent, who had been in service for 30 years and who regarded the new mistress with the particular brand of professional courtesy that barely conceals deep skepticism. The running of the house was Catherine's responsibility in the sense that every decision of any consequence was ultimately hers. What the household ate for every meal, what time the servants rose and what their duties were, whether the front parlour curtains needed replacing, when the china closet was last properly inventaried, which tradesman delivered the best coal, how much was budgeted for the wine cellar, whether the kitchen accounts balanced at the end of the month, and, if they did not, why not. There is a book that every serious Victorian housewife was expected to own, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861. Mrs. Isabella Beeton compiled it from a series of magazine articles she had written, and it is one of the strangest and most fascinating documents of the Victorian era. It is 900 pages long. It covers recipes, naturally, thousands of them, with a precision and attention to timing that was genuinely revolutionary in domestic writing. But it also covers servant management, family finance, the treatment of common illnesses, the etiquette of dinner parties, how to organize a larder, the legal rights of servants, the proper way to set a formal table, and what to do if someone in the household is poisoned. 900 pages. And Mrs. Beeton had finished writing most of it by the time she was 23 years old, which is both impressive and slightly bewildering. The first line of Mrs. Beeton's book is one of the most famous sentences in Victorian domestic literature. As with the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise, so it is with the mistress of a house. She opens with a military metaphor, and she means it. The management of a Victorian household was, in her view, a form of command, requiring strategy, discipline, knowledge, and consistent authority. A mistress who could not control her servants was like an officer who had lost the confidence of her troops. The household would not function. The meals would be late and badly cooked, the rooms improperly cleaned, the accounts falsified, the silver mysteriously depleted. Catherine had read Mrs. Beeton. She had been given her own copy by her mother, who had annotated certain passages. She had read it the way a student reads a textbook before an examination, which is to say carefully, with anxiety, and with the uncomfortable sense that there was more in it than she fully understood. The part she understood least at first was servants, how to manage them, where the line was between authority and harshness, what to do when a servant made a mistake, what to do when a servant lied, which happened, what to do when a servant cried, which also happened, what to do when you yourself were not entirely certain what the correct protocol was and could not ask, because asking would undermine the authority you were supposed to project at all times. Mrs. Beeton was very clear on this last point. The mistress should never show uncertainty before her servants. She should consult her manuals, her mother, her female friends, but not in front of the staff, not in ways that made visible the fact that she was still learning. The appearance of authority was itself a form of authority, and Catherine spent the first months of her married life performing competence she was still in the process of developing. There were hierarchies within the servant world that were as rigid as anything above stairs. The cook was senior to the housemaids. The lady's maid, who dealt directly with the mistress, occupied a peculiar position. She was in some ways higher status than the housemaids, because her work required more skill and brought her into closer personal contact with the mistress, but she was also more dependent on the mistress's goodwill than the cook was, because a cook who was good at her work could find a new position easily. A lady's maid who fell out of favour had a harder time recovering. The servants ate separately. They ate in the kitchen or in the servants' hall, depending on the size of the household. They went to bed at a time determined by the household's rhythm, typically after the last family member had retired and been settled. They rose before the family, before Catherine's bell, before Edward's morning rituals, because the fires needed to be lit, the water heated, the kitchen stove started, the newspapers retrieved from the front step before anyone in the family came downstairs and noticed they hadn't been. Mrs. Trent, the housekeeper, managed all of this. She reported to Catherine each morning, usually between 9 and 10 o'clock, after Catherine was dressed. They would go over the day's requirements together, what was needed from the market, what repairs needed to be arranged, whether any servant had a grievance or had made an error that needed addressing. Mrs. Trent brought a small notebook to these meetings. Catherine had one too, a household journal, in which she recorded the decisions made, the accounts reviewed, the orders given. These meetings were, in their quiet way, the central act of Catherine's professional life. They were where she exercised the authority that was actually hers, unmediated by Edward or his opinions. They were where she was in charge. Edward, for his part, mostly stayed out of the household's domestic mechanics. This was standard. The men of the upper and middle Victorian classes maintained a principled ignorance of how their domestic comfort was actually produced. A dinner appeared on the table at 8 o'clock. How it got there was not their department. The sheets were clean. Who washed them and dried them and pressed them was not their concern. There was a social agreement in place that preserved this ignorance as something dignified rather than lazy, and most men of Edward's class upheld their end of it without any apparent effort at all. What Edward did care about, genuinely, not performatively, was the social calendar, who was coming to dinner, who they had been invited to dine with, whether their social engagements were appropriate to their standing and aspirations. A dinner party in 1865 was not merely a pleasant way to spend an evening, it was a statement. The guests you invited said something about who you were. The food you served said something about your household's competence and income. The conversation that happened at your table would be discussed elsewhere, and the impression your wife made, as hostess, as conversationalist, as the visible face of the household's domestic competence, would be assessed and scored in ways that mattered. Catherine understood this. She had been raised to understand it, and so the preparation for each dinner party was substantial. Days of planning, menus negotiated with the cook, silver polished, wines selected, flowers arranged, the table set and reset until it was right. She would review the guest list and think through the seating arrangement, which was its own form of chess. You did not put the two men who had argued about railway stocks at the last party within conversational range of each other. You ensured that the woman who had been recently widowed was not placed beside the couple who could not stop discussing their new baby. You seated people who would draw out the best in each other, or at least avoid drawing out the worst. All of this planning was invisible by design. When the guests arrived, the house was simply ready, warm and fragrant with candles and flowers, the table perfectly laid, the cook's preparations already underway in the basement, Catherine in the front parlour in her evening dress, smiling and making everyone feel that this had required no effort at all. The evening dress deserves its own paragraph, because it was, by day-to-day standards, extraordinary. Day dress, which Catherine wore for the morning and afternoon hours, was dark in colour and relatively sober in decoration, appropriate for a married woman of good standing who might receive callers or make calls herself, functional enough for the supervision of household duties, composed and proper. Evening dress was something else entirely. The neckline was lower, significantly lower than anything she would have worn during the day. not immodestly so by Victorian formal standards, but in a way that marked the event as special, the hour as different from ordinary hours. The skirt was fuller, the fabric richer, silk or satin rather than wool or cotton, deep colours, jewel tones, jewels too, which a married woman could display where an unmarried girl could not, real ones if the family had them, paste if they did not, but worn regardless, hair dressed more elaborately by her lady's maid, sometimes with flowers or ribbons or small ornaments worked into the arrangement. Edward, in his black evening coat and white cravat, was impeccably turned out in roughly the same way every evening. The formal male costume of the period offered very little variation. It was Catherine who bore the weight of decorative presentation for both of them. Catherine, whose appearance at the dinner table would be noticed and commented upon. Catherine, whose choice of colour and jewellery and hair arrangement sent small signals that other women in the room would receive and interpret and quietly discuss on the carriage ride home. This was understood by everyone, including Catherine, as natural, as simply the way things were. The idea that it might be something else, a demand, a labour, a performance required of women and not of men, had no widely available language yet. Dinner, when it arrived, was a serious affair. A formal Victorian dinner party in a middle or upper-class household proceeded through multiple courses, served in a sequence that had its own strict logic. The first courses were soups and fish, then came the removes, the main meat dishes, roasted or braised, served with vegetables, then game, if it was the season, then a sweet course, perhaps two, then dessert, fruits, nuts, cheese, the port that the men drank after the women withdrew. That last detail, the women withdrawing, was one of the more peculiar rituals of Victorian dining, and one that has attracted a great deal of commentary then and since. When the dessert course was concluded, Catherine would catch the eye of the most senior woman at the table, rise, and all the women present would rise with her and follow her to the drawing-room, leaving the men at the table with the port and the cigars and the conversation that was, apparently not suitable for female ears. What the men discussed during this period has been preserved somewhat less carefully than you might expect, partly because men of that era were not great keepers of diaries, and partly because the conversation itself was often less portentous than its exclusivity implied. Business, yes. Politics, occasionally something indiscreet, sometimes just more of the same conversation that had been happening across the dinner table, now slightly looser, less edited. The women in the drawing-room, meanwhile, talked, gathered in the warm upholstered space around the fire, cups of tea appearing, the formality of the dinner table relaxing somewhat. They talked about the things they were allowed to talk about, and sometimes, obliquely, about the things they weren't. Children, always, health, their own and others, books. The Victorians were prodigious readers, and a new novel by Trollope or Collins would circulate among a social group for weeks, each woman passing her copy to the next. Charitable work, which was one of the few arenas in which upper and middle-class Victorian women could exercise something that resembled professional ambition, and the careful, coded conversation about domestic life, about husbands, about households, about the texture of daily married existence that happened in the space between sentences, in tone and implication rather than in explicit statement. Catherine was good at this kind of conversation. She had been trained for it in the same informal way she had been trained for everything else that mattered in her life, not through explicit instruction, but through observation, imitation, and the quiet correction of her mother's raised eyebrow when she said something too direct. After about half an hour, the men rejoined the women. The evening continued with some combination of cards, music, someone at the piano, which was nearly obligatory, and conversation until the guests departed, usually around 11. Then Catherine and Edward were alone, and the house was quiet, and the servants were still finishing the work that an evening like this had generated in the kitchen and dining room below. And Catherine, who had been performing for several hours, finally sat down. That sitting down, that specific moment of quiet after the last guest's carriage had rattled away up the street, that is one of the details I keep coming back to. The evening had been what it needed to be, the food had been good, the conversation had gone reasonably well, no disasters, no awkward silences that lasted too long. Edward seemed satisfied, which mattered. And yet, there is a word that historians of Victorian women's experience use a lot: constraint. The restrictions that shaped a middle or upper-class married woman's daily life were not always dramatic or obvious. They were structural, built into the fabric of the day, the week, the social calendar, so thoroughly that most women did not think of them as constraints at all, just as the shape of things. Let us talk about what Catherine's week actually looked like, because the daily texture of a married Victorian woman's life is where the history becomes most vivid and most human and most worth sitting with. Mondays were traditionally laundry days in a well-ordered Victorian household. Not that Catherine did the laundry herself. She did not. That was the work of the housemaids and the cook's helper. But she supervised the process, reviewed the accounts for laundry supplies, and dealt with any problems that arose. Laundry in 1865 was a substantial undertaking. There was no running hot water, no washing machine, no dryer. Everything was washed by hand, in large copper tubs heated over the kitchen stove, scrubbed with lye soap and rinsed repeatedly. The household linens alone, the bed sheets, the tablecloths, the kitchen cloths, the towels, the servants' aprons, represented hours of physical labor. Add to that the family's clothing and personal linens, and a wash day in a middle-class Victorian household was a full day's hard work for at least 2 people. The ironing came the day after. Flat irons heated on the stove, tested against the back of the hand for temperature, wielded across every surface that needed to be smooth, and almost every surface needed to be smooth, because a wrinkled tablecloth or a poorly pressed camise represented a failure of standards that would be noticed by anyone who saw it. Mondays were traditionally laundry days in a well-ordered Victorian household. Not that Catherine did the laundry herself. She did not. That was the work of the housemaids and the cook's helper. But she supervised the process, reviewed the accounts for laundry supplies, and dealt with any problems that arose. Laundry in 1865 was a substantial undertaking. There was no running hot water, no washing machine, no dryer. Everything was washed by hand, in large copper tubs heated over the kitchen stove, scrubbed with lye soap and rinsed repeatedly. The household linens alone, the bed sheets, the tablecloths, the kitchen cloths, the towels, the servants' aprons, represented hours of physical labor. Add to that the family's clothing and personal linens, and a wash day in a middle-class Victorian household was a full day's hard work for at least 2 people. The ironing came the day after. Flat irons heated on the stove, tested against the back of the hand for temperature, wielded across every surface that needed to be smooth, and almost every surface needed to be smooth, because a wrinkled tablecloth or a poorly pressed chemise represented a failure of standards that would be noticed by anyone who saw it. There is something specific about the physicality of Catherine's dressing routine that I want to spend a moment with, because it is so central to her daily experience, and because I think it tends to be either romanticized or dismissed in the popular imagination when it deserves something more honest. Getting dressed in 1865 took, in total, somewhere between 45 minutes and 2 hours depending on the occasion and the complexity of the result. The chemise went on first, a long, fine cotton shift that protected the outer clothing from direct contact with the skin and could be laundered more easily than the dresses themselves. Then the corset, which Agnes laced from behind, the long back laces threaded through eyelets that ran from the small of the back to the shoulder blades. The lacing required 2 hands and a certain amount of practiced pull, and Catherine could not do it herself because human arms do not bend in the direction the task requires. She depended on Agnes for this every single day of her adult life. The sensation of being laced into a corset is not one that most modern people have direct knowledge of, and I want to try to describe it accurately rather than sensationally, because the sensational version of women fainting and broken ribs and organs displaced is mostly an exaggeration, and the accurate version is interesting in a different way. A well-fitted corset, laced to ordinary daytime tightness, did not cause pain. It created pressure, specifically around the waist and lower rib cage, a firm encirclement that changed the way the body moved and sat. You could not lean forward deeply. You could not twist sharply at the waist. Your posture was modified, straightened, lifted by the structure itself, which meant that the ideal Victorian posture, upright and composed, was partly architectural rather than purely volitional. You got used to it. Women who had worn corsets since adolescence reported that they felt in later life genuinely uncomfortable without them, that the lack of support felt disorienting, the way a person used to glasses feels disoriented when they remove them. The corset was not an external imposition in the way that popular history sometimes presents it. For most women who wore them, it was part of the felt experience of being properly dressed, which is to say part of the felt experience of being a self in the world. A tighter lace pulled for special occasions, for the evening silhouette that social pressure required, that was a different experience. The restriction of the lungs, the slight compression that made deep breathing impossible for hours, the redness left on the skin beneath the fabric, the relief, famous among women who described it in their diaries and letters, of loosening the lace at the end of an evening. One woman in 1872 wrote that the removal of her evening corset felt like being forgiven for something she had not done. After the corset came the crinolette, the small padded structure worn at the back of the hips to create the fashionable silhouette of the mid-1860s. Then the petticoats, at least two, sometimes three, the outer ones of a quality and colour that might be briefly glimpsed when the dress moved. Then the dress itself, which was constructed in a way that required assistance to enter. It fastened up the back, sometimes by hooks and eyes, sometimes by small covered buttons, sometimes by a combination of both. Getting a woman into a correctly fastened dress with a fitting bodice was a two-person operation. Then the shoes, the boots, properly, leather, side-buttoned, requiring the button hook to fasten the dozen or so buttons running up the inner side of the ankle, the gloves for going out, the hat for going out. A Victorian woman going out without a hat was advertising, however inadvertently, that she was not a respectable woman, or at least not a careful one, and Catherine was always careful. The whole assembly, finished, looked effortless. This was its achievement and its paradox. The more labour had gone into it, the more natural it was supposed to seem. Tuesday and Wednesday were typically the days for shopping, not personally, in most cases. Catherine sent lists. The cook made her own market list for fresh produce and meat, which was reviewed and approved each morning. The household's accounts with various tradesmen, the grocer, the butcher, the fishmonger, the wine merchant, were reviewed weekly, and the invoices checked against the goods actually delivered. This checking was not optional. The potential for domestic staff to pad accounts, to take small percentages for themselves from vendor transactions, was well understood, and a mistress who did not keep careful accounts was considered naive and vulnerable to exactly the kind of slow household theft that could quietly double your expenses over a year. Catherine was good at the accounts, better than she had expected to be. Her mother had insisted on it, teaching her daughter not just the pleasant accomplishments of piano and French and watercolour, but the rather less glamorous accomplishment of being able to read a column of figures and spot when something did not add up. Catherine had resented this instruction at the time and was grateful for it now. Thursdays were often the day for calling, social calls, the visits that constituted the visible working of a Victorian social life. This requires some explanation, because the etiquette of Victorian calling was so specific that the details have the quality of an elaborate game. When a married woman in 1865 wanted to maintain a social connection to another family she knew, to a woman she had recently met at dinner, to a family new to the neighbourhood, she paid a call. She dressed in her afternoon visiting dress, took her carriage or, in some cases, walked if the distance was reasonable, and arrived at the house. She gave her calling card to the servant who answered the door. The servant took the card in on a small silver tray. Now, if the family was at home, which meant specifically if the mistress of the house was available to receive, the servant returned to say so, and Catherine was shown in. Tea appeared. Conversation happened for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. No longer, as a rule. You were not there for a long visit. You were there for a call, and a call had a specific duration understood by everyone involved. Then Catherine rose, said her goodbyes, and left. The whole thing was brief, formal, and completely unlike genuine conversation in almost every respect. If the family was not at home, or if the mistress simply did not wish to receive that afternoon, which was a socially accepted option, the servant returned to say so, and Catherine left her card. The card would be placed on the silver tray in the hall, alongside the other cards that had accumulated since the tray was last cleared. A good collection of cards on the tray signaled a socially active household. The mistress of the house would later review the cards and decide whom to return calls to and in what order, which was itself a form of social communication. The card, incidentally, was not a simple piece of stiff paper with a name on it. Victorian calling cards were elaborately produced, carefully chosen. The quality of the cardstock, the typography, the presence or absence of a crest or monogram all communicated information about the caller's status. A new bride left her own card and her husband's card together, folded at the corner in a specific way to indicate a personal visit rather than a card left in absence. The corners meant things. Which corner was folded meant things. There was an entire secondary language operating through the folded corners of Victorian calling cards, and while historians debate whether the meanings were truly standardized or varied by household and region, the cards themselves, thousands of which survive in archives and private collections, testify to the seriousness with which this world took its own rituals. Friday was often given to charitable work. For middle and upper-class Victorian women, charity was not just a virtuous activity, it was an expected one. A woman in Catherine's position, who did not give her time to some form of organized charity, would have been considered selfish in ways that went beyond personal failing into a kind of social failure. The charitable organizations available were many and varied. Church-connected associations for the poor of the parish, societies for the relief of distressed gentlewomen, women who had fallen from higher social positions through widowhood or the failure of a family business, and who needed support without the stigma of ordinary poverty, organizations running schools for the children of working-class families, missionary societies, hospital visiting committees. Catherine was on the committee of 2 local organizations. She attended their meetings. She contributed money from her personal allowance. She sometimes visited the recipients of charitable assistance personally, which brought her into contact with lives that were, in their concrete daily details, almost unimaginably different from her own. She found these visits both difficult and important. Mrs. Beaton had thoughts on charitable visiting too, on the proper attitude to take, the proper conduct to maintain, the line between compassion and condescension that a lady needed to walk with care. Saturday was sometimes left less structured. Edward was more likely to be home. They might drive in the park. They might receive informal visitors. They might, in the evenings, attend the theatre or the opera, which were both forms of social obligation and genuine pleasure. Victorian theatre and music were not the genteel experiences we might imagine. A Victorian opera audience was loud, expressive, and not especially reverent about the performance happening on stage. People talked during the opera. They visited each other in their boxes during the intervals. The performance was partly what was happening on stage, and partly what was happening among the audience. Going to the opera was, among other things, a way of being seen by the right people, in a setting that allowed for the kind of extended socializing that the dinner table did not permit. Sunday, always, was church. Twice, if the household was pious, which most middle and upper-class Victorian households were, at least outwardly. The morning service and the evening service, with Sunday afternoon as the quietest stretch of the week. No calls, no formal entertaining, reading and family conversation, and the particular quality of light that Sunday afternoons had, slow and domestic, and slightly removed from the ordinary time of the other 6 days. Let us go back to Catherine. Let us be specific about what a Tuesday morning in February 1866 felt like. She woke, as usual, without an alarm. There was no such thing, not as we understand it. She woke to the light, which in February was pale and arrived late, seeping around the edges of the heavy curtains. Her husband had already gone downstairs. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of movement in the house below. She lay still for a few minutes, the warmth of the bed considerable, the air outside it not. The fire in the bedroom grate had been lit at some point. She had not heard the housemaid come in, which meant she had been asleep when it was done, and the room had begun to warm, but the warmth was not yet uniform, and the air near the window was still cold enough that she could see it. She rang for her maid. Agnes had been with the household for about 8 months, having replaced a previous maid who had left to be married, a departure that Catherine had been expected to view as a desertion, but had privately thought was very reasonable of her. Agnes was brisk, competent, and had a quality that Catherine valued more than it perhaps sounds. She was not a gossip. The servants' world of gossip and observation, and the circulation of household information through below-stairs conversation, was something Catherine was always aware of, without being able to directly address. Agnes seemed, as far as Catherine could tell, to keep her own counsel. The morning routine of dressing has been described elsewhere, in the reference scripts I have drawn from, with great specificity. I will not rehearse every layer here. Suffice to say that by the time Catherine descended the stairs at 9:15, she was in full day dress, a dark wool gown with a fitted bodice, a high collar, and sleeves that buttoned at the wrist. Her hair arranged in the way appropriate for a married woman of her age receiving visitors, the small items of her appearance that were visible all correct and composed. She looked, in the phrase of the time, perfectly turned out. The phrase carried no suggestion of effort, though effort was its entire substance. Edward was already at the table with the newspapers when she entered the dining room. He stood when she came in. This was automatic, a reflex of courtesy so deeply trained it had ceased to require thought, and said good morning. She said good morning. She took her seat, and the breakfast appeared. Eggs, toast, marmalade, a rack of cold meats for Edward, who was more substantial in his morning eating than she was, tea for her, coffee for him. They talked briefly about the news, a parliamentary debate, a friend of Edward's who had written, the weather, which continued to be February weather. These breakfasts were, in their contained way, pleasant. They were one of the few times in the day when Catherine and Edward were simply in the same room, without an audience or a social obligation imposing its shape on the conversation. Edward was, she had concluded in the 14 months of their marriage, a reasonable man. He was not unkind, he was not cruel, he had opinions, some of which she agreed with, and some of which she did not, though she was careful about how she expressed disagreement. He was interested in her household management in the abstract, in the sense that he was glad the household ran well, but not in its details, which he found dull. He was generous with money for the household's expenses, and somewhat less generous with the personal allowance, which was a source of small, unspoken friction that Catherine had learnt to work around. She had been told, before the marriage, that he was a good man. This had been the primary recommendation offered. A good man, from a good family, with good prospects. All of these things were true, and none of them gave her a great deal to work with in the daily intimacy of shared life. Did she love him? That is the question, isn't it? The question that every modern reader wants answered. And the honest answer is that Catherine would have found the question, as it is framed, somewhat baffling. Love, in the romantic sense, was not the primary architecture of a Victorian marriage. It was hoped for, certainly. Fondness and respect, and a kind of companionable warmth were expected to develop over time. The literature of the era was full of love stories, and the Victorians consumed them voraciously, which tells you something about the gap between the life as it was lived and the life as it was imagined. But the marriage had not been built on the foundation of overwhelming passion, and neither partner had expected it to be. It had been built on suitability and financial compatibility, and the judgment of both families that the match was sound. What grew inside that structure was what grew, and it grew differently in different couples, and most Victorian women of Catherine's class would not have recognized the modern assumption that a marriage built on anything other than mutual feeling was somehow deficient. She had married a good man. She was running a good household. These were, in the framework she had been given, the things that mattered. After breakfast, Mrs. Trent. The morning meeting with the housekeeper was held in the front parlour rather than the drawing room, at a small writing table where Catherine's household journal sat open. Mrs. Trent arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, which she always did. They reviewed the day. The cook needed more coal oil, the delivery had been short. A housemaid had apparently been receiving letters from a young man, and while this was not explicitly forbidden, it was considered disruptive to the household's smooth operation. And what did Mrs. Trent think? There was a dinner on Saturday for which a fishmonger's bill had come in higher than expected. Catherine approved the coal oil requisition on the housemaid and her letters. She asked Mrs. Trent to speak to the girl, remind her of the household's rules about followers, and make clear that the letters were the girl's private business provided they did not affect her work. She was, in her quiet way, slightly more lenient on this point than some mistresses would have been. Mrs. Trent noted this without comment. on the fishmonger's bill. She reviewed the invoice, found one item she was not certain had been delivered, and sent a note to the fishmonger requesting clarification. By 11 o'clock the meeting was done, and Catherine was free to spend the next 2 hours as she chose, within the available options. This stretch of the late morning was, in its way, the closest thing she had to private time. She might read. She was working through a novel, Wilkie Collins, The Woman in White, which had come out in 1860, but which she had only recently got around to, borrowed from a friend who had pressed it on her with a warmth that suggested it was important. She might write letters, which were many and constant, letters to her mother, to her sisters, to female friends scattered across the country. She might do needlework, which was a socially acceptable occupation that could be done while someone else read aloud, or in the company of guests, or in solitude. She might practice the piano, which she still did, though less frequently than she had when she was a girl, and it was part of her accomplishment repertoire rather than a private pleasure. The distinction between private pleasure and social performance is one that I keep circling around in all of this, because it seems to me to be one of the defining tensions of a Victorian married woman's life. Almost everything she did could theoretically be observed. Almost every activity had a social dimension. The piano was both something she played for herself and something she might be asked to perform at any evening gathering. The needlework was both craft and decoration, and a signifier of domestic virtue. Even her reading was not entirely private. What she had read was conversational material, part of the shared cultural vocabulary she needed to navigate her social world. There was, and I mean this quite precisely, almost no space in her day that belonged only to her. The afternoon was calls. She went out at 2 o'clock in the carriage, with 3 calls to make. The first was to a woman who had delivered a baby 3 weeks ago. Catherine brought a small present, spent 20 minutes, admired the child, said the right things. The second was to a family new to the neighbourhood, recently moved into a house 2 streets over, whom she was visiting for the first time as an act of social welcome. The third call was almost a social call, to an older woman, a widow, who was on the same charitable committee as Catherine, and with whom she had a genuine friendship that was unusual in its frankness and its warmth. This woman's name was Mrs. Hargreaves. She was 58, had been widowed for 9 years, had adult children scattered across the country, and lived in a small house in Bayswater that she had arranged exactly as she pleased. She received Catherine in a slightly cluttered sitting room, full of books and a prodigious number of cats, none of which appeared to have been formally invited, but all of which were clearly permanent residents. She gave Catherine tea in a cup that was slightly chipped, and talked with her for 45 minutes, instead of the prescribed 15, which was an ongoing mild transgression that both women committed happily and regularly. Mrs. Hargreaves said things that nobody else Catherine knew said. Not scandalous things, not radical things exactly. She was a woman of her time, in most respects, but things that were stated plainly, without the social wrapping. She had said on one occasion that the reason most women had trouble with their first babies was not medical but informational, and that the information was deliberately withheld from them, and that this was absurd and cruel and entirely avoidable. She had said on another occasion that marriage was an excellent institution for men and a complicated one for women, and that the complications were worth naming, even if they were not worth refusing, and that naming them was the beginning of something, though she was not sure exactly what. She had said, some months ago, that Catherine seemed sometimes to look as if she were carrying something very heavy while pretending it was weightless, and had Catherine ever considered writing down what she actually thought, because the mind needed somewhere to put things that could not be said aloud. Catherine had gone home from that particular visit and bought a small leather-bound journal. She had not yet written very much in it. She was not certain how to begin. There is something in Mrs. Hargreaves that I find genuinely moving. A woman who lived at a slight angle to the social expectations of her world, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been called rebellion, but in the small daily ways that kept her intact inside a structure that required a great deal of self-erasure. She was warm. She was funny, which was allowed for older women in a way it was not quite allowed for young ones. She was specific in her opinions in a way that middle-class Victorian women were not generally supposed to be. And she offered Catherine something that was in remarkably short supply in Catherine's life, the experience of being seen clearly and spoken to honestly. That, too, is a form of history, not the history of dates and legislation and named events, but the quieter history of what women gave each other in the constrained spaces available to them. I want to stay with that for a moment because it matters enormously and is often left out. The female friendship that Catherine had with Mrs. Hargreaves was not unusual, not in kind, only in its degree of honesty. Victorian women's lives were dense with female relationships, with mothers and sisters and aunts, with the friends made at school and in the neighbourhood, and through the charitable committees, with the women who appeared at calling hours week after week until the formal etiquette of the call gave way, slowly, to something warmer. Female friendship in this world was not a supplement to the important relationships of marriage and family. In many ways it was the architecture of daily life. The men had their clubs, their professions, their public world. The women had each other. The letters that Victorian women wrote to each other are among the most vivid documents of the era. They circulated constantly, long, dense, detailed, written in the evenings or the quiet stretches of the morning, sent by post, which was, by the 1860s, remarkably frequent in urban areas. Multiple daily deliveries in London meant that a letter sent in the morning could reasonably expect a reply by the afternoon of the same day. This meant that women who lived across a city from each other could conduct something very close to a real-time conversation by letter, and they did. The content of these letters was not always what the etiquette of Victorian life publicly permitted. The social performance of the calling hour, pleasant, non-controversial, carefully managed, was not the same thing as what happened in the letters. The letters said things. They discussed marriages with a frankness that the drawing-room could not accommodate. They analysed husbands and children and mothers-in-law and household crises with the specificity of people who understood each other and were not performing for an audience. They offered support in the practical forms that female friendship has always offered: advice, information, the specific knowledge of what works and what does not. They also offered emotional support in language that was, by our standards, remarkable in its directness and warmth. There is a documented correspondence between two women, friends from girlhood, later separated by marriage to men in different parts of England, that began in 1849 and continued, letter by letter, for over 30 years. The letters were preserved by accident, found in a house clearance in the 1980s. The women wrote about being pregnant, about losing children, about the frustrations of managing servants and the pleasures of managing them well, about books they had read and ideas they had encountered and what they thought about them, about their husbands, with affection, with irritation, with occasional remarks of such pointed honesty that it is slightly startling, 200 years later, to encounter them on the page. What these letters tell you is that Victorian women's inner lives were not the smooth, placid, decorative things that the official domestic ideology suggested. They were complicated, searching, sometimes angry, sometimes joyful, always specific. The official story, the woman as pleasant, subordinate, content in her sphere, coexisted with the lived story, which was considerably more various. The letters are the lived story. Catherine's letters to her mother and sisters were more careful than this, more managed. She had not yet found the full trust that those two women had developed over decades, but the letters to Mrs. Hargreaves, written occasionally in the evenings when Edward was in the library and the house was quiet, were beginning to move in that direction. She had written, recently, about Eleanor, about the specific quality of the feeling she had when she was with Eleanor, some mixture of love and terror and wonder, and the sense of being responsible for a thing so small and so alive that it was almost unbearable. Mrs. Hargreaves had written back that this was, as far as she could tell, exactly what motherhood was, and that the inability to adequately describe it was part of its essential nature, and that Catherine had just described it adequately. The late afternoon, returning home around 4:30, was the household's pivot point. Edward would be home by 6, dinner at 7:30 or 8. Catherine supervised the kitchen preparations briefly, not intrusively. The cook had everything in hand, but a single visible check that confirmed hierarchy and ensured no last-minute crises, then went upstairs to change for dinner. Even when they were dining alone with no guests, evening dress was expected. This was a rule that Catherine had initially found slightly exhausting and had later come to understand as functional. The change of dress marked the day's division between the domestic working hours and the social evening hours. The ritual of changing created a boundary, a transition, a small daily pause. You removed the afternoon and put on something different for the night. There was something in that, even if the corset was, after a long day, no more comfortable at 8 in the evening than it had been at 8 in the morning. Edward came home, and the evening settled into its pattern. Dinner, conversation, perhaps some reading in the back parlour. On Tuesdays there were sometimes evening visits, friends dropping in, the slightly less formal version of social life that happened after dinner in private rather than at organised events. On a quiet Tuesday like this one, they sat together, and Edward read the evening paper, and Catherine worked on her needlework, and from the street outside came the sounds of a city going about its night. Edward came home, and the evening settled into its pattern. Dinner, conversation, perhaps some reading in the back parlour. On Tuesdays there were sometimes evening visits, friends dropping in, the slightly less formal version of social life that happened after dinner in private rather than at organised events. On a quiet Tuesday like this one, they sat together, and Edward read the evening paper, and Catherine worked on her needlework, and from the street outside came the sounds of a city going about its night. I want to spend a moment with Edward here, because the Victorian husband is so often either idealised or demonised in popular history that the actual person gets lost. He was neither a tyrant nor a saint, and the category of decent man of his era doing the best he knew deserves more attention than it usually gets. Edward's world was almost entirely outside the house during the working hours. He left the Kensington townhouse each morning by 8:30 and returned, on ordinary days, by 6. In the intervening hours he was at his chambers. He was a solicitor, specialising in property and estates, and at the kinds of lunches and meetings and club afternoons that constituted the professional and social life of a middle-class Victorian man. His club was in Pall Mall. He went there 2 or 3 times a week, not for anything specific, for the newspapers and the comfortable chairs and the particular quality of male company that existed there, which is to say company that did not require any management. He did not have to be pleasant to anyone at the club. He did not have to make the conversation flow or ensure that the right people were seated near each other. He could be quiet, or he could talk, as the mood took him. This freedom, the freedom to have moods and to express them in the way a man's social world permitted, was one of the structural differences between his daily experience and Catherine's that neither of them fully named, because neither of them fully recognised it as a difference. It was simply the air of their respective worlds. Edward was not, in his private estimation, a difficult man to be married to. He was not violent, he was not cruel, he was not a heavy drinker, which in the Victorian era was a distinction worth making, specifically because heavy drinking among middle and upper-class men was so common that sobriety was genuinely notable. He was generous enough. He was interested in Catherine in the way that a man who has chosen a wife he respects continues to be interested in the person he chose, not with the consuming urgency of courtship, which had faded into something quieter, but with the genuine regard of someone who has shared his life with a person long enough to know them and finds the knowing pleasant. What Edward did not do was consider, not in a calculating way, not out of malice, but the question of what his wife's inner life actually contained, what she thought about, beyond the household and the children and the social calendar, whether the shape of her days was adequate to who she was, whether the £40 and the morning meeting with Mrs. Trent and the calling hours represented the full range of what she was capable of. These questions did not occur to him with any regularity, not because he was incapable of asking them, but because the world he had been raised in did not encourage him to. He assumed, as a reasonable man of his era, that a woman who managed her household well and was a pleasant companion and expressed no open discontent was a woman who was essentially satisfied. The absence of complaint registered as contentment. The presence of the performed cheerfulness that the manuals prescribed registered as actual cheerfulness. He was not wrong, exactly. Catherine was not, by any reasonable measure, in serious distress, but he was not entirely right either, and the gap between what he understood about her life and what was actually in it was, quietly, always there. This is the marriage, not dramatic, not a story with a villain, just 2 people, each living inside their own world's assumptions, finding each other in the overlapping parts of those worlds. Dinner, the quiet evenings, the shared concern for Eleanor, the moments of genuine conversation that happened more often than either would have predicted, and not often enough for either to feel fully known, and calling it a life, which it was, a real one, with its own texture and its own pleasures and its own particular weight. and there is something I want to say about what it feels like to have spent so much time inside this world while writing it. There is a particular quality of attention that historical research requires, not the distant analytical attention of the archivist, though that is part of it, but something closer and stranger, a kind of extended imaginative habitation. You are trying to feel the weight of the corset, not just know about it. You are trying to hear the quality of silence in a Victorian townhouse at 10:30 in the evening, when the servants are below and the child is asleep and the husband is reading and the only sound is the fire and the faint rattle of the street outside. You are trying to understand what it felt like to know with absolute certainty that the law did not recognize you as an independent person, not theoretically, felt, in the body, in the daily experience of being that person. I do not claim to have fully succeeded. The past is not fully accessible. What I have come away with, above everything else, is the sense that the Victorian women inside these marriages were trying to live well, to love correctly, to maintain the surface while managing the interior, to be more than the role assigned to them in the ways available to them, which were narrow, and to find in the friendships and the letters and the piano and the private journals the room to be fully themselves. That trying, that persisting, that is the whole story. And I want to be honest with you about something, here in the quiet of wherever you are. That texture, as I have been describing it, the calls, the accounts, the menus, the morning meetings, the evening dress, the careful social performance, can sound, from where we sit, like a kind of gentle suffocation, and for some women it was. There are enough Victorian letters and diaries that say so, plainly enough, that we should not pretend otherwise. But it was also for many women a life that contained real satisfactions, the satisfaction of running a complex household well, the satisfaction of social skill exercised with genuine pleasure, the satisfaction of friendships like the one with Mrs. Hargreaves, intense, honest, sustaining in a way that the official social world could not quite account for, the satisfaction of genuine intellectual life, which many Victorian women had, conducted through books and letters and the conversations that happened when the right people were in the room together, and the satisfaction sometimes of the marriage itself, of the quieter moments when Edward was simply a person she was glad to know, and she was simply a person he was glad to have near him, and the institution and its rules receded a little into the background of the evening. These satisfactions existed inside the constraints. They did not cancel them. They did not make the constraints invisible or harmless. They existed alongside them in the way that most of human experience involves finding meaning within structures we did not design and might not have chosen. There is one more dimension of Victorian married life that I want to bring into focus before we look at the physical reality of the body inside the institution. It is a dimension that modern accounts of this world tend to glance at briefly and then move on from, perhaps because it is so at odds with the comfortable domestic imagery that usually frames this history. I am talking about death. Victorian marriages were regularly interrupted by death in ways that ours are not because people did not also die in our era, but because the tools for keeping people alive were so much more limited, and the deaths were therefore so much more common and so much closer to home that they shaped the entire emotional texture of married life in ways that are difficult to fully register from the outside. A Victorian wife who reached her 50th birthday, having buried no one she loved deeply, would have been extraordinarily lucky. Most had buried children. Infant mortality rates throughout the Victorian era were high enough that the loss of a child in the first year of life was considered, if not expected, then at least not exceptional. Upper-class families with access to medical care lost fewer infants than working-class families, but they still lost them. The neatly embroidered baby shoes in the back of the linen press, the small marble tablet in the church floor, the name in the family Bible with the dates written very close together, and husbands. A wife might outlive a husband by decades, might be widowed young, might find herself in the peculiar legal and social limbo of Victorian widowhood, which gave a woman more legal autonomy than marriage, technically, since a widow recovered her legal personhood, but also removed the financial security and social status that marriage provided. Victorian widows of the middle and upper classes had to manage carefully. A widow with money and property of her own, particularly after 1882, had real options. A widow without money had fewer. The rituals surrounding death and mourning in Victorian England were elaborate to a degree that seems almost designed to make grief visible, communal, and socially regulated. When a family member died, the household went into mourning. This meant a specific sequence of observances that varied in length and intensity depending on the relationship to the deceased. For a wife who lost her husband, the deepest possible mourning, the observance was substantial. Full mourning lasted, by the strictest Victorian standards, 2 years for a widow. During the first year, her clothing was entirely black. Not fashionable black, not interesting black, dull, matte black, made of a specific fabric called parramatta or crepe, which had a texture and finish that prevented any sheen or shimmer. Even on a summer day, in a heat that made the heavy fabric miserable, the mourning dress was black and covered. No jewellery except jet, which was black. No hair ornamentation, no patterns or colour of any kind. The face and hands were the only visible skin, and even those were often covered by a black veil when going out. In the second year, the mourning softened slightly. By the middle of the second year, a widow might begin to introduce what was called half-mourning: grey, mauve, lavender, white. These transitions were managed carefully because they were socially observed. A widow who moved out of full black too quickly was considered disrespectful of her husband's memory. A widow who stayed in full black beyond the expected period was considered, somewhat anxiously, to be wallowing. The social management of grief as a performance, with a specific timeline and a specific set of visual requirements, is one of the more striking aspects of Victorian domestic culture. It reflected a genuine desire to honour the dead with appropriate solemnity, but it also reflected the Victorian conviction that private feelings were most decently expressed through socially shared forms, that grief, like everything else, had its correct forms of expression, and that those forms mattered. What this meant for a woman who had lost her husband and was genuinely, deeply devastated, who needed time and solitude and quiet and the freedom to feel what she actually felt without performing it for anyone, was complicated. The mourning rituals gave her permission to withdraw from social obligations, which was genuinely valuable. They gave her a vocabulary for her grief that the world around her recognized and respected, but they also imposed a structure on the grief itself, a shape it was supposed to take and a schedule it was supposed to follow that did not always match the actual experience of loss. Mrs. Hargreaves, when Catherine knew her, had been in widowhood for 9 years. She had passed through all the stages of the mourning dress and had emerged on the other side in the somewhat unconventional arrangement of the cluttered sitting room and the cats and the excellent, honest conversation. She did not often discuss her husband, who had died of a fever while travelling abroad, quickly, with no opportunity for farewell. But she had said once to Catherine that the most useful thing the mourning period had given her was the 1.5 years of social withdrawal that the full mourning customs had entitled her to. No calls returned, no dinner parties, nothing required of her except the wearing of the black dress and the management of her household. It had been, she said, the first time in her adult life that she had been inside her own house, alone, for long enough to hear what she actually thought. Catherine had held that observation in her mind for months. These satisfactions and these complications existed inside the constraints. I want to look more closely now at something that is harder to write about, the physical reality of marriage, the body inside the institution, because the Victorian domestic narrative tends to exist, in popular imagination, at a level of deliberate vagueness about bodies and physical experience that was itself a Victorian cultural product. Let us gently set that vagueness aside. A married Victorian woman of Catherine's class was expected to produce children. Not just expected, she was, in a real sense, under a form of social and familial pressure to produce them that began almost immediately after the wedding and continued until it was clear, for one biological reason or another, that no more were coming. The frequency with which women congratulated each other on pregnancies and asked after the health of children in their correspondence tells you something about how central reproduction was to the social identity of a married woman. A woman who remained childless involuntarily was pitied, quietly and persistently. A woman who seemed uninterested in having children at all was regarded with suspicion. Childbirth in the 1860s was genuinely dangerous. Not universally. Many women had uneventful deliveries and recovered quickly and were fine, but the risks were real. Puerperal fever, which is a bacterial infection introduced during or after delivery, killed women at significant rates throughout the Victorian era, even after the connection between contaminated hands and infection had been identified by Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s. Semmelweis's findings were largely ignored by the medical establishment for another 2 decades. Even by the 1860s, hand-washing before delivering a baby was not yet standard practice everywhere. Obstetric hemorrhage was another risk. Complications from malpresentation, from a long and difficult labor, from the exhaustion that accumulated when a woman had borne many children in close succession. All of these were real possibilities, and the women in Catherine's world knew this, not in an abstract way. They knew it because they had sisters or friends or neighbors who had not survived. They knew it the way people know things that are close and personal and part of the fabric of ordinary life. Knowing this, and still proceeding, carrying children, attending births, visiting women who were recovering or who were not recovering, required a kind of steady courage that was so routine as to be invisible. Nobody commended Victorian women for being brave about childbirth. It was expected. The courage was assumed. The fear, if it existed, was managed privately. Catherine had been pregnant once. She had delivered a daughter the previous spring, a healthy girl who had been named Eleanor and who was at this moment 11 months old, occupying a nursery on the 4th floor with a nursemaid named Bessie, who was 19 years old and utterly devoted to her. Catherine visited the nursery in the morning and again in the afternoon. She was not the child's primary caretaker. This was considered normal, not neglectful, but she was genuinely, warmly present in Eleanor's life in the ways that the structure of the household allowed. The presence or absence of children in a Victorian upper-class marriage was mediated heavily by the presence of servants. A woman in Catherine's position did not physically nurse her own child in most cases. Wet nurses were common practice in wealthy households, with a hired woman employed to breastfeed the infant. She did not rise in the night with the child. That was Bessie's work. She was not the person who changed the child, or bathed the child, or carried the child for hours when the child was sick and could not sleep. These tasks belonged to the nursemaid. What Catherine provided was supervision, love in the form of presence and attention, and the network of decisions, which doctor, which nursemaid, which toys and books and routines, that shaped Eleanor's early environment. This arrangement seems cold, written down, and there is plenty of Victorian writing that critiques it on those grounds. Reformers and moralists of the era who argued that the distance between mother and child produced in upper-class children a particular emotional blankness, a difficulty with genuine warmth that was a social pathology worth naming. There is also writing from women of this class who pushed back on that critique, who said that love was not measured in physical proximity and that they knew their children and were known by them, and the nursemaid arrangement did not change the fundamental relationship. Both of these things are probably true in various proportions in various families, and the truth of a particular mother-child relationship in 1865 is not something we can recover from the outside with any confidence. This arrangement seems cold, written down, and there is plenty of Victorian writing that critiques it on those grounds. Reformers and moralists of the era who argued that the distance between mother and child produced in upper-class children a particular emotional blankness, a difficulty with genuine warmth that was a social pathology worth naming. There is also writing from women of this class who pushed back on that critique, who said that love was not measured in physical proximity, and that they knew their children and were known by them, and the nursemaid arrangement did not change the fundamental relationship. Both of these things are probably true in various proportions in various families, and the truth of a particular mother-child relationship in 1865 is not something we can recover from the outside with any confidence. Let me add something here about what Eleanor's own life as a Victorian child born into this household was going to look like, because the children inside these marriages are also part of the story, and their world is worth attending to. Eleanor, at 11 months, was still in the nursery world that was entirely managed by Bessie. She was fed, bathed, dressed in the elaborately smocked and embroidered garments that Victorian babies of good family wore, taken for afternoon walks in the new perambulator, a relatively recent invention, becoming popular in the 1840s and now considered essential in households like this one, and managed through the rhythms of a very young child's day with Bessie's experienced and affectionate oversight. As Eleanor grew older, the nursery world would become more structured. A nursemaid for a Victorian upper-class child managed more than physical care. She was the child's constant companion in the early years, the person present for the first steps and the first words, the person who held a feverish child at 2 a.m, and who knew which stories sent the child to sleep and which made her more wakeful. The intimacy of the nursemaid-child relationship was real and sometimes profound, in a way that created its own complications for the children involved. Some Victorian adults wrote in later life about nursemaids with the kind of specific, embodied tenderness, the smell of someone, the quality of their voice, the particular gesture of comfort that tends to be reserved for the people who shaped us earliest. These nursemaids did not appear in the official family narrative. They were servants, but they were, for many Victorian children, among the most formative human presences in their early lives. When Eleanor was old enough for lessons, 3 or 4 years old for very basic instruction, more formal schooling by 5 or 6, a governess would arrive. The governess was another extraordinary figure in the Victorian domestic landscape. She was a woman of good family, but reduced means, educated enough to teach, not wealthy enough to live independently, occupying the peculiar social position of someone who ate with the family, but was not family, who had more education than the servants, but less security than the children she taught. Victorian literature is full of governesses, most famously Jane Eyre, because the governess's social in-betweenness, too genteel for the servants' hall, too dependent for the drawing room, was a ready-made dramatic situation that illuminated the precariousness of women's lives when separated from male financial support. The education Eleanor would receive from a governess was designed, as I mentioned earlier, to prepare her for the life her class expected of her. Languages, certainly French, probably some Italian, music, piano was nearly compulsory, drawing, watercolour, a little history, a little geography, a little natural science framed as the appreciation of God's creation rather than as systematic inquiry. Literature, within limits. The limits mattered. Victorian girls were discouraged from reading certain things, novels with morally ambiguous characters, anything that might inflame the imagination in unhelpful directions. The libraries of Victorian girls were curated. What a girl read was considered formative in a direct and literal sense, and the books available to her were chosen accordingly. Catherine, thinking about Eleanor's eventual education, found herself hoping that the girl would have more of it than custom strictly required, more books, more ideas, more of the intellectual life that Catherine herself had found her way to through novels borrowed from friends and the conversations with Mrs. Hargreaves and the long private hours of reading that nobody officially encouraged, but that had been, in the event, the thing that kept her most fully herself. She had not said this to Edward. She would say it eventually, in the way that things get said in a marriage, sideways, indirectly, in the form of a book left on a table or a comment made at breakfast, not as an argument, but as a gradual accumulation of small signals, each one mild enough to pass without conflict, that eventually amounted to a position, womanly tact, as the manuals would have it. She was good at it. She knew she was good at it, and she was not entirely comfortable with knowing that. What I notice is the structure, the way that the household, in its organization, put a layer of paid labor between the mother and the most physically demanding work of raising a child, and then measured that mother's maternal love not by her physical labor, but by her moral influence, her reading to the child, her prayers over the child, her visible warmth, and her supervision of the child's religious and moral development. The labor, once again, rendered invisible. The love, expressed in forms that required no physical effort, celebrated as the higher thing. Let us stay with the body for another moment, because there is something here that I do not want to pass over too quickly. A Victorian married woman of the middle and upper classes was, for much of her adult life, either pregnant or recently delivered, or nursing, or in the recovery period that followed all of these things. Victorian families were large by modern standards. 5 or 6 children for a middle-class family was common, and considerably more than that for working-class families. Each pregnancy represented months of physical change, of increasing physical restriction, of the modifications to dress and routine and social appearance that a visible pregnancy required. Each delivery was a medical event of some seriousness, attended by a doctor and a monthly nurse, a woman employed specifically for the lying-in period, who managed the mother's recovery, and requiring weeks or months of recuperation. Each nursing period, for those women who nursed their own children, involved the physical reality of a body in service to another body in a quite direct and demanding way, and through all of this, the pregnancies, the deliveries, the nursing, the recoveries, the corset continued, not as tight, not as constructed, sometimes modified for the later stages of pregnancy, but present. The commitment to the shaped silhouette, to the body as a social performance, persisted through all the biological realities of the maternal body with a stubbornness that, again, strikes us as strange from outside. I am not saying this to condemn the Victorians. I am saying it because it illuminates something about the relationship between bodies and social expectation that is not entirely unfamiliar. Catherine's body, in February of 1866, was recovering from the birth of Eleanor 11 months earlier. She was not pregnant again, not yet. The question of when she would become pregnant again was not one that she discussed with anyone, including Edward. It was simply one of those things that happened or did not happen and was not in her hands in any direct sense, because the means of preventing it were either non-existent or unavailable, or considered so improper that access to them required a kind of practical boldness that most women of her class did not have. There were women who did manage the timing of their families. There were women who found, through the circulation of knowledge that happened in female social networks, through the oblique conversations at calling hours, through the letters that said certain things between lines and meant other things on them, the practical information that allowed them some degree of agency over their own fertility. But this was not straightforward, not safe, and not reliably effective. For most women in Catherine's position, the size of your family was largely a matter of what happened to you, not what you decided. This is not a small thing. The ability to make deliberate choices about reproduction is, as any historian of women's lives will tell you, one of the most significant factors in the shape of a woman's life, in what she can do, where she can go, what ambitions are available to her, what her body is like at 40 compared to what it might otherwise have been. Victorian women, by and large, did not have this ability. They bore what came, and what came shaped everything else. Let us shift, now, from Catherine's interior life to the social world surrounding marriage more broadly. Because Catherine's experience, while vivid and specific, was one variation on a theme that played out across class lines in ways that were often dramatically different. Working-class marriage in Victorian England was a different institution from the middle-class version in almost every material respect, while sharing the same fundamental legal structure. A working-class woman who married still lost her legal personhood under coverture. She still became, in law, an extension of her husband. She still had almost no recourse if the marriage was violent or abusive. Divorce was available in theory after 1857, when the Matrimonial Causes Act created civil divorce courts for the first time, but in practice it required legal proceedings and social stigma that made it inaccessible to most people. A working-class woman leaving a bad marriage had, in 1865, very few options. She could go home to her parents, if they had room and were willing. She could attempt to support herself, which was extremely difficult on wages available to working women of the era. Or she could stay. The 1857 Act was, in fact, one of the significant pieces of Victorian legislative history that directly concerned women's lives, and it is worth pausing on. Before 1857, divorce in England required a private Act of Parliament. This meant it was available only to the very wealthy and the very determined. You needed money for lawyers, connections to parliamentary members, and a social fortitude to endure the publicity, because a parliamentary divorce was a public proceeding, and the details of a marriage's failure were therefore a matter of public record. Working-class people, middle-class people of ordinary means, simply did not divorce. They separated, sometimes. They lived apart, sometimes informally, sometimes by mutual agreement, but they remained legally married. The 1857 Act changed this. It created divorce courts that could grant divorces through a legal process rather than a parliamentary one, making it accessible in principle to a much wider range of people. The catch, and there was a catch, there was always a catch where Victorian women were concerned, was that the grounds for divorce were not the same for husbands and wives. A husband could divorce his wife on the grounds of her adultery alone. A wife seeking to divorce her husband had to prove not just adultery, but adultery combined with something aggravating: cruelty, desertion, incest, bigamy, or certain other specific circumstances. A wife who had simply been betrayed, who had discovered her husband's infidelity and wished to leave the marriage, did not have grounds. She had to prove something more and worse. This inequality was debated in Parliament during the Act's passage. Several members found it obviously unjust and said so plainly. The majority found it natural and necessary. The argument offered was, essentially, that a wife's infidelity was more damaging to the social order than a husband's because it introduced uncertainty about the paternity of children, and the social order depended on legitimate inheritance, and therefore the two things were not equivalent. Whether the men making this argument believed it or were simply defending a system that benefited them is a question that the historical record does not clearly answer. The double standard, in any case, was enshrined in law and would remain there until 1923, when it was finally equalized. Before we continue with the broader legal and legislative history, I want to stay with working-class marriage for a moment longer, because the contrast with Catherine's life is so stark, and the history of working-class Victorian wives is so often flattened into a simple story of deprivation that misses the actual human complexity. A working-class woman who married in the 1860s, let us call her Ellen, a factory worker's wife in Manchester, entered marriage with a completely different understanding of what was expected of her. There was no calling card etiquette in Ellen's world. No morning meeting with a housekeeper, no silver tray in the hallway, no separate drawing room and dining room. Ellen's household was, in all probability, 2 or 3 rooms in a terraced house shared with other families, with a single hearth in the front room that served for both cooking and heat. Ellen's wifely duties were physical in a way that Catherine's were not. She rose before 6, and the first thing she did, before anything else, before tea, before her children were awake, was the fire. The fire had to be cleared of the previous night's ash, the grate cleaned, the new coal laid, the kindling set, and the match struck. The warmth in the room that followed was not incidental comfort. It was survival, particularly through the Manchester winter, which arrived early and left late, and had a dampness to it that worked its way through the walls of poorly insulated terraced housing with very little resistance. She cooked everything on that fire. There were no separate kitchen ranges, not in a house like this. Porridge in the morning, perhaps bread, if she had the ingredients and the time to bake it, though many working-class women bought their bread from a baker because baking required fuel and time that could not always be spared. The midday meal, if anyone was home for it, if the children were young enough not to be in school, if her husband did not eat at the mill. The evening meal, always, because even the longest day had to end in something hot if the family was to sleep without the particular misery of going to bed cold and underfed. Working-class women in this era often worked outside the home as well, before children arrived, and sometimes after. The textile mills of the industrial north employed enormous numbers of women and girls. Domestic service, obviously, but that removed a woman from her own household entirely, placing her in someone else's. Laundry work done at home, taking in washing from wealthier households for a small fee. Needlework, piecework done by hand that paid extraordinary little for hours of labor that ruined the eyes. Street selling in cities, agricultural work in rural areas, seasonal, hard, and poorly compensated. A working-class wife's management of money was, in its way, as demanding a skill as Catherine's management of the household accounts. The difference was that Ellen was managing a budget in which the margin between fed and hungry was extremely small, and the consequences of a miscalculation were not a slightly higher fishmonger's bill, but genuine privation. She had to know, to the penny, what the week's wages would be, and what could be done with them. Rent first, coal, food, the children's boots if they had worn through, her husband's work clothes if a tear had become a hole, medicine when someone was sick, which in a house where 6 people shared 2 rooms and the water came from a communal pump in the street was not an infrequent event. The diet in a working-class Victorian household was starchy and repetitive by necessity, not by choice. Bread, potatoes, oatmeal in the north, occasional cheap cuts of meat, the parts that the butcher could not otherwise sell, the offal, the bones boiled down for soup, vegetables when cheap and in season, tea, always, because tea was cheap and warming and provided the kind of mild stimulation that made a long day of physical labor slightly more bearable. Alcohol, too, not as a luxury, but as a dietary staple for many working-class men and women, because the water supply in industrial cities was genuinely dangerous, and beer was safer, not stronger beer, not ale meant for celebration. Small beer, weak, barely fermented, but consumed daily for the reasonable practical purpose of not dying of cholera. Ellen's relationship with her husband was governed by the same legal architecture as Catherine's. He had the legal authority, she had the legal dependence, but the way that authority expressed itself in a two-room terraced house in Manchester was different from the way it expressed itself in a five-story Kensington townhouse. There was no question of separate spheres in quite the same sense. Both people were too close, too physically present in the same small space, too entangled in the daily economics of survival, for the gentleman upstairs, lady downstairs division to operate properly. Some working-class marriages, as a result, had a functional equality that upper-class marriages carefully avoided in form, even when they approximated it in spirit. A husband and wife who both worked, who both managed money, who both cooked and cleaned in the absence of domestic staff to do it for them. These couples sometimes arrived at a practical partnership that the middle classes would have found somewhat improper, not always. Violence within working-class marriages was a documented and significant problem, and the legal protection available to women experiencing it was for most of the century inadequate at best. But the absence of the strict gender division of labor that characterized the upper classes meant that working-class marriage was, at least potentially, less rigidly hierarchical in its daily operation. The one thing that did not change across class lines was the physical reality of reproduction. Working-class women had more children on average than their middle-class counterparts, not because they wanted to in most cases, but because the means of limiting family size were even further from their reach. The practical consequences of large families in a small house with a limited budget were not theoretical. Every child born required more food, more clothing, more space that did not exist, and more of a mother's physical labor in the care and feeding of the new arrival. The women who died in childbirth died across all classes, but the rates were higher for working-class women, whose physical condition going into labor was often compromised by years of inadequate nutrition and punishing physical work. This is not a comfortable history, but it is real, and it was the reality for the majority of Victorian married women, not the calling cards and the evening dresses and the dinner parties of the middle class, but the fire at 6 in the morning, and the accounts managed to the penny, and the children coming one after another, and the body wearing out in service to all of it. The legal condition of married women improved in other ways during the Victorian era, and these improvements are worth noting because they tell you something about the slow, piecemeal nature of change in this area. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1878 allowed a wife who had been physically assaulted by her husband to obtain a separation order from a magistrate and to have custody of her children and to keep her own wages. The 1870 Married Women's Property Act, strengthened in 1882, allowed married women to own property in their own name. This was a remarkable legal shift, overturning centuries of coverture doctrine, and it was fought for by women and men who had been making the case for decades. After 1882, a married woman's earnings were legally hers. Her inherited property was legally hers. She was, in law, a person again. Catherine would have known about these legal changes, at least vaguely. The debates around married women's property rights were public and ongoing throughout her adult life. She had thoughts about them, careful thoughts, not radical ones, but real ones. She could have imagined, without much difficulty, what it would mean for her own life to have clear legal ownership of the £40 she managed each year, to be able to sign a contract, to have some standing somewhere. These were not the thoughts she expressed at dinner parties. They were the thoughts she wrote in the small leather journal that she had bought on the advice of Mrs. Hargreaves. The etiquette manuals that govern this world of rules deserve a proper look because they are among the most extraordinary documents of the Victorian era, and they are frequently misunderstood. Modern readers tend to encounter them as evidence of repression, as the machinery of social control, which in some ways they were, but they were also something else. They were written by women, largely for women, in a tone of practical sisterhood that is easy to miss if you are only reading for what they forbade. Mrs. Sarah Ellis published a series of books in the 1830s and 1840s that had enormous influence. The Women of England, The Daughters of England, The Wives of England, The Mothers of England. The Women of England alone sold nearly 100,000 copies. These were not obscure texts. They were read the way best-selling self-help books are read today, hungrily, repeatedly, with passages underlined and shared with friends. Mrs. Ellis's central argument was that women of the middle classes were the moral backbone of English society, not because they had political power or professional authority, but precisely because they did not, because their sphere was the private one, the home. They were uniquely positioned to shape the character of the nation through the shaping of the men and children in their families. A wife of good character, in Mrs. Ellis's framework, was not a subordinate figure. She was a figure of tremendous, if invisible, influence. The care she took with her household, the cheerfulness she maintained under difficulty, the moral example she set for her children, the support she gave her husband, not passive support, not uncritical support, but the support of a woman who was genuinely good and who made the household a place where goodness was possible. All of this mattered, Mrs. Ellis argued, in ways that the visible public sphere of men's work could not match. The world was changed, ultimately, not in Parliament or in commerce, but at the family table. This argument was convenient for the social order and deeply limiting to the women it applied to. I do not want to defend it, but I also want to acknowledge that it gave many Victorian women a framework for understanding their lives as meaningful, a framework they found genuinely sustaining, whatever we might think of its implications. To tell a woman that her daily labour matters, that her moral presence shapes the world around her, that she is not simply doing domestic chores, but doing something of consequence, this was not nothing, especially in a world that offered so few other ways of being told that your existence matters. The rules for a wife's conduct, as they emerge from these manuals and from the etiquette books and from the advice columns in women's magazines, cluster around a few central obligations. The first was what they called cheerfulness. A wife was expected to maintain a pleasant demeanour in the home regardless of her own feelings, not falsely, not in a way that required theatrical performance. The manuals were careful to distinguish between genuine good temper and its simulation, and generally disapproved of the simulation. But the home was supposed to be a refuge from the difficulties of the world outside, and the wife's emotional state set the temperature of that refuge. If she was irritable, the home felt cold. If she was anxious, the anxiety spread. If she was consistently pleasant and calm and moderately cheerful, the home felt like what it was supposed to feel like. The pressure this created to manage one's genuine emotional state in service of the household's atmosphere was not acknowledged as pressure. It was acknowledged as character. A woman who managed her feelings well had good character. A woman who did not was failing in her duty. The second obligation was deference, which is a word that requires unpacking. Deference in the Victorian wifely context did not mean agreement with everything a husband said or did. It meant the formal acknowledgement, in public and in the general conduct of the household, that his authority was the final one. She could advise him. She could share her opinions. She could, in the privacy of a marriage that operated well, have considerable real influence over decisions that were formally his to make. But the public posture had to be one of deference, because to undermine a husband's authority in any visible way was to undermine the household itself. There is a particular phrase I encounter repeatedly in these manuals: womanly tact. Womanly tact was the art of achieving your ends without appearing to seek them. It was the ability to guide a husband toward a decision you had already reached without letting him notice that the guidance was happening. It was the soft management of authority that operated entirely beneath the surface of the relationship's formal hierarchy, and it was described in these manuals as one of the higher feminine arts, a skill requiring intelligence, patience, and genuine knowledge of the person you were managing. What it was, in plain terms, was an elaborate form of concealment. The intelligence needed to exercise womanly tact was intelligence that could not declare itself. The influence achieved through it was influence that could not acknowledge itself. It was competence that had to masquerade as accommodation. I find it difficult to read those passages without thinking about what the women who practiced it most skillfully must have felt in the private hours about the particular shape their intelligence had been required to take. The third obligation was what might be called appearances, the maintenance of the household's social standing through the visible management of all those things that could be seen, the state of the house, the quality of the dinner parties, the cleanliness and propriety of the children, the appropriateness of the wife's own dress and manner in every social setting. Appearances in this context were not vanity. They were the working medium of a social world that communicated status and respectability through visible signs, and a wife who let the appearances slip was failing in something that had real consequences for the whole household. And then there was the fourth obligation, which the manuals addressed less directly, but which was understood by everyone: the management of the husband's comfort in the most intimate sense, the physical care of the marriage, the wife's availability, her willingness, her management of the intimate side of the relationship in ways that kept the husband satisfied and the marriage stable. This was discussed in language of duty and willing spirit and the obligation of the marriage bed, and it was discussed, almost without exception, from the assumption that the wife's own feelings in this area were secondary to the husband's needs. The space between what a wife was permitted to feel and what she was required to do was in this area more than any other the space where Victorian women lived in the most difficult kind of silence. There was no language for it. There was no social acknowledgement of its difficulty. There was only the duty clearly stated and the expectation widely shared that a good wife met it without complaint. Let us go further back in time for a moment. Let us think about the girls who would become Victorian brides, because the preparation for marriage, the specific, deliberate, years-long preparation for the role of wife, began in childhood and shaped everything. Girls in middle and upper-class Victorian households were educated, but with a specific goal in mind. The accomplishments, piano, drawing or watercolor, French and sometimes Italian or German, basic letter writing, a little history and geography, the domestic skills, needlework, embroidery, the supervision of a household if they were trained by a mother who took this seriously, and the social arts, the ability to speak pleasantly in company, to manage conversation with grace, to receive and pay calls correctly, to play their part in the social rituals that would constitute their adult lives. This education was deliberately not the same as a boy's education. Boys of the same class studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, natural philosophy, literature, history, a curriculum designed to prepare them for professions, for public life, for the management of property and the exercise of civic authority. The curriculum for girls was designed to make them suitable wives and mothers. Not ignorant, Victorian middle-class women were often extremely well-read, deeply cultured, intellectually capable in ways that the official curriculum did not cultivate, but that women cultivated themselves through the novels and the lending libraries and the long private hours of reading. But the official educational program for a Victorian girl was never confused about its purpose. There is a phrase from a very well-known Victorian text on the education of women that I have been thinking about since I started researching this. John Ruskin wrote, in 1865, the very year we have been inhabiting, a lecture on the proper sphere of women's life, published as part of a collection called Sesame and Lilies. He wrote that a woman's education should be essentially different from a man's, not less in breadth, but different in direction, oriented toward those qualities that make her a better companion, a wiser governor of a home, a more beautiful influence upon the character of those around her. He was not saying women should be kept ignorant. He was saying they should be cultivated for a specific purpose, and the purpose was, entirely and openly, to be good wives. Ruskin was not extreme by the standards of his time. He was, in some respects, unusually respectful of women's intellectual capacity. The vision he articulated was considered progressive in certain circles, and yet the structure of it, The idea that a woman's education existed to serve her function within marriage rather than to serve her as an individual, that was not controversial. That was mainstream. That was the water. I find myself thinking about what that does to a person. Not the specific restrictions, not the corset and the calling cards and the complicated rules. Those are the visible surface of something deeper. What I keep thinking about is the more fundamental thing, what it does to a person to grow up knowing, with certainty, that your education is preparation for becoming part of someone else's life, that the skills you are being taught are designed to make you an appropriate companion, a competent manager of another person's household, a suitable mother of another person's children, that the self you are developing is a self-oriented, from its very beginning, outward, toward the needs and expectations of others, rather than inward toward your own nature and its possibilities. Catherine was not, by any measure, a crushed or destroyed person. She was intelligent, capable, warm, genuinely skilled at the life she was living. She found real pleasure in it, real satisfaction, real meaning. And she carried, somewhere quietly, the small leather journal, the place where the unsaid things went. That journal and what was in it is something we will never fully know. Most of the private writings of Victorian women were not preserved. They were burned at death by the women themselves or by their families, because the contents were not considered literature, they were private. They were the unshared half of a life. What we know instead is the public half, the calling cards and the accounts and the dinner parties and the charitable committee meetings, the social machinery and the domestic rituals, the carefully managed appearance of a life running smoothly. The way the whole elaborate system reproduced itself, generation after generation, through the education of daughters and the selection of husbands and the management of households and the slow accumulation of days that looked like other days. And yet, things were changing, slowly, unevenly, with fierce resistance from the people and institutions that benefited from the status quo, but changing. The women making the arguments for property rights and education and the equal grounds for divorce. They were there in the 1860s and the 1870s, writing and speaking and organizing. The first women's college at Cambridge, Girton, was founded in 1869. The first women petitioning Parliament for the right to vote had been doing so since the 1840s. Barbara Bodichon, who had campaigned for the Married Women's Property Act for years, was one of the founders of Girton. She had also, in 1854, written a pamphlet called A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws Concerning Women, which laid out, in exactly the clear and simple terms its title promised, what the legal condition of married women in England actually was. She handed out copies at social events, at tea parties, in parlours not entirely unlike Catherine's back parlour on a Tuesday evening. The world was not static. The constraints were real, and they were contested, and the contesting was happening in the same decades and the same drawing rooms where the constraints themselves were being enforced. History is rarely one thing. It is almost always at least two things at once. Let us follow Catherine through the rest of her day and through into the evening and into the particular quiet that follows a long day well managed and brings a person, finally, at last, after everything, to the edge of sleep. By 6 o'clock the household has shifted into its evening mode. The kitchen is producing the rich, warm smells of something long cooking, a joint of beef, tonight, with root vegetables, and a cream pudding for dessert. Catherine is in the dressing room on the first floor, changed now into her evening dress, her hair redressed by Agnes, who works quickly and silently. The house is warm, the fires in the ground floor rooms have been built up for the evening. The candles, gas lighting has been installed in the front rooms, but Catherine prefers candlelight in the drawing room, and Edward has indulged this preference, lit. It is just the two of them tonight, a small relief if she is honest. The formal dinners are important, and she manages them well, but there is a specific kind of tiredness that comes from an evening of sustained social performance that does not come from a quiet evening at home. Edward is in the library. She can hear the faint scratch of his pen. He has correspondence of his own, business matters, the letters he writes and receives in his professional life that exist in a world she is adjacent to but not part of. She sits in the drawing room with Collins's novel, the window dark and rain-grey outside, and reads for 40 minutes before dinner is announced. They eat together, just the two of them at the large dining table. This too is a ritual that changes depending on the night. When they dine alone, the formal machinery of the table, the multiple glasses, the ordered progression of courses, is still present, because to abandon it would be to allow the household to slip into a casualness that was considered the beginning of disorder. But the conversation is different, easier perhaps, less performed. Edward tells her about a matter at work. She listens. She asks a question that is genuine. He is surprised by it, in a way that is slightly painful to notice. Surprised, she thinks, that she has something to say about the matter that is not simply agreeable noise. She says a second thing. He thinks about it. He disagrees, mildly, and explains why. She listens to the explanation. It is, she decides, a reasonable point. She says as much. This is as close as they get to an equal conversation. It happens, in forms like this, several times a week. It is not nothing. After dinner, the library. Edward resumes his correspondence. Catherine is at the piano. She plays for perhaps 30 minutes, not for performance, just for herself, working through a piece by Mendelssohn that she has been practicing for some weeks. The piano in the evening is one of the consistent pleasures of her day. There is something in the act of playing, the specific demand it makes on attention, the way it fills the room and the mind simultaneously, the way it does not require her to be anything other than someone who is playing the piano, that she values in ways she has never exactly articulated. She thinks briefly about Mrs. Hargreaves's cats, about how strange it would be to have a house arranged entirely as one wished, without the negotiation and compromise that shared life required. Strange and perhaps lonely, but interesting. She pulls her attention back to the music. At 9:30, the last of the household's evening work is done below stairs. The kitchen is cleaned, the fires banked, the servants settling into their own late evening, their own brief private time before their early morning. Bessie, in the nursery above, has settled Eleanor after a bath and a story. Catherine can hear, very faintly through the ceiling, the particular silence that follows a child finally asleep. At 10 o'clock approximately, Edward puts down his pen. Catherine closes the piano lid. They go upstairs together. The bedroom, when Agnes has prepared it, is warm and candle-lit and quiet, the curtains drawn, the bed turned down. The small rituals of the night-time, the removal of jewellery, the loosening of the hair, the elaborate reverse process of the morning's dressing, happen with Agnes's assistance, and then Agnes dismissed, in the privacy that closing the door creates. There is a marriage happening here, in the real, physical, daily sense. In the accumulation of nights like this one, and mornings like the one that will follow, and all the days between them. It is not the marriage of novels, the marriage of grand passion and desperate letters and the trembling moment of first touch. It is the other kind, the kind built of ordinary days and small considerations, and the particular intimacy of two people who share the same walls and the same table and the same name and the same bed for years, and come to know each other in the way that long proximity produces, which is different from the way that sudden love produces, but is not in its own quiet register, less real. I have been thinking about Catherine all through the writing of this, about whether she was happy, about what that question even means, asked of someone whose life was structured in ways so different from what we consider a baseline that our usual measures barely apply, whether she was happy in the way we mean it, fulfilled, self-expressed, the author of her own story, probably not, fully in those terms, whether she was happy in some other sense, purposeful, useful, loved in the ways available to her, engaged with a life that demanded real skill and provided real satisfactions. Yes, I think so, in parts, unevenly, the way most people are. What I keep coming back to is the privacy, the small leather journal, the 40 minutes of piano at the end of the day, the conversations with Mrs. Hargreaves, the moments before the morning bell when she lay still and the day had not started yet and she was simply herself, thinking her own unshared thoughts in the particular grey light of a London winter morning. Those moments are not in the historical record, not really. They leave almost no trace. And yet they are, I think, some of the most important things I have tried to describe tonight, because they are where the person was, not the wife, not the mistress of the household, not the social performer, not the legal extension of her husband, just the person, in the quiet before the bell. Let us come back now to the question of what a Victorian marriage asked of a woman, not just what it gave her, the structure, the security, the social identity, the purpose, the children, but what it cost. The rules of wifely conduct in Victorian England were never entirely codified in a single place, but they were thoroughly understood nonetheless. They were transmitted through etiquette manuals, which multiplied throughout the Victorian era to address every possible social situation with specific guidance. They were transmitted through women's magazines, which ran columns on household management and social conduct with a frequency and specificity that suggest a readership hungry for instruction. They were transmitted through the example of mothers and older female relatives, and through the correction, often gentle, sometimes sharp, of female social peers. The primary obligation was something that Victorian writers sometimes called duty. Wifely duty covered a range of behaviours that we might today describe differently: the duty to manage the household competently, the duty to maintain one's appearance at all times, the duty to be a pleasant and accommodating companion to one's husband, the duty to receive his family and friends warmly, the duty to support his social and professional ambitions, the duty, always, to preserve the appearance of domestic harmony in public, whatever the private reality might be. That last item, the gap between public appearance and private reality. This is where I want to slow down, because it is one of the most consequential and least discussed aspects of Victorian marriage. A Victorian wife who was unhappy in her marriage, for whatever reason, from simple incompatibility to genuine suffering, had almost no acceptable public outlet for that unhappiness. She could not discuss it at calling hours. She could not write about it openly in the correspondence that might be read by others. She could not leave, not easily, not without consequences so serious they constituted a new problem layered on top of the original one. She could not expect the sympathies of most institutions: the church, which managed marriage as a sacred and permanent bond; the law, which gave her almost no recourse; the medical profession, which had a disturbing tendency to pathologize women's distress as nervous disorders, requiring treatment with rest and limited stimulation. What she could do was manage the appearance, conduct herself in public as a satisfied wife, maintain the social facade with such consistency and skill that no one outside the marriage could be certain there was anything to observe. This management of appearance was not considered dishonest. It was considered self-discipline. It was considered the mark of a woman of breeding and good character. The ability to maintain the surface when the interior was troubled was, in the Victorian moral framework, a virtue. I sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves to sit. The experience of distress in a Victorian marriage was often an entirely private one, carried without language, without outlet, without the recognition that there was anything to name. The diary existed, sometimes. The intimate female friendship existed, sometimes. And sometimes the suffering simply accumulated in the body, in the nervous complaints and the physical ailments and the long unexplained illnesses that Victorian women experienced at rates that contemporary physicians found puzzling and modern historians find considerably less so. Not every Victorian marriage was unhappy. Let me be clear about that. Some of them were genuinely warm, genuinely equal in spirit if not in law, genuinely sustaining to both people inside them. The correspondence between Alfred and Emily Tennyson, between Charles and Emma Darwin, between Thomas and Jane Carlyle, these are relationships that reveal in their letters something that functions like genuine intellectual partnership, genuine mutual care, genuine shared delight in each other's company. They were not perfect, none were, but they were real, and they were good, and they existed inside the same legal structure as the worst marriages of the era. Marriage, in every era, is as various as the people making it. The institution is one thing. What people do inside it is something else. Catherine and Edward, over the 14 months of their marriage, had developed a household and a life that was by most measures functional, and by some measures more than that. He was not cruel. She was not diminished in any sharp or dramatic way. The children that would come, Eleanor was already there, and 2 more would follow in the next several years, would be raised in a house that was, by the standards of its time, a good one, not perfectly happy, not without friction, without the small silences and the small compromises and the occasional evenings when something went unsaid that would have been better said, but a life, a real one, with its own texture and its own pleasures and its own particular weight, worth understanding, worth sitting with, worth the kind of attention that turns facts and dates and legal statutes into something that breathes. The rain has stopped somewhere in the middle of the night. The fire in the bedroom has burned down to a low red glow. Eleanor is asleep upstairs, her breathing small and steady, her small hands curled at her sides. The street outside the Kensington townhouse is quiet, the particular quietness of a Victorian city night, never fully silent, always containing within its quiet the distant sounds of other lives, other households, other people making their way through the dark toward morning. Catherine is asleep, her hair is braided, as it always is at night. The journal is on the nightstand, beside the candle that has been extinguished. She will write something in it tomorrow, maybe. She has been thinking about what Mrs. Hargreaves said, about naming things, about the beginning of something. The house breathes around her. The servants are asleep in their rooms at the top and bottom of the building. Edward is asleep beside her. The city is half asleep outside. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all of this, the rules and the rituals and the legal structures and the daily performances and the small genuine pleasures and the things unsaid and the things written in private, somewhere in all of it, a woman is lying in the dark and thinking her own thoughts. That is the whole of it, really. That is where we arrive, after all the history and all the detail and all the careful tracing of the architecture of a Victorian life, at the same place we always arrive, in the end, a person in the dark, thinking. I find something deeply moving in that. I am not sure I can entirely explain why. Maybe because it is the one thing that does not change across all the centuries and all the social systems and all the elaborate structures that human beings build around the business of living together. The private self, persisting, not extinguished by the institution, not fully contained by the rules, present, quietly, in the small leather journal and the moments before the bell and the 40 minutes of piano at the end of the day. Victorian marriage was many things. It was a legal institution designed by men for men's benefit in ways that were explicit and widely understood and only slowly changed. It was a social architecture that organized women's lives with extraordinary thoroughness, from the education of girlhood to the rituals of widowhood. It was the central organizing fact of a Victorian woman's material existence, her income, her housing, her social identity, her access to her own children all flowing from it. It was, for many women, the source of genuine suffering that had no legitimate outlet and no easy remedy, and it was also the place where people tried to love each other under whatever conditions were available to them, with whatever language they had, in the moments that the rules left open. Both of these things are true. I do not want to end on only one of them. The world Catherine lived in is gone. The legal architecture of coverture is gone. The formal calling hours and the silver card trays and the elaborate ritual of the wedding trousseau are gone. The world in which a woman became, legally, an extension of her husband on the day she married him, that world is gone. What is not gone is the question underneath all of it, the question of what we owe each other inside the intimate structures we build, of how we balance the demands of the institution against the needs of the person inside it, of where the rules end and the human being begins. Those questions are older than the Victorians, and they will outlast us too. The fire is very low now. The rain has stopped. Eleanor upstairs in the nursery shifts in her sleep and is still again. The house settles. The old sound of a house at night, the creak and release of timbers adjusting to the change in temperature as the fire in the kitchen goes cold. In the small leather journal there is a sentence, just one so far. Catherine wrote it last week and has not gone back to it. It reads, "I think there is more to say than is usually said." Yes, there is. There always has been. You have been travelling a long way tonight through the particular world of a Victorian marriage in 1865, through the courtship and the engagement, through the wedding and the white dress and the careful negotiations of the settlement, through the house and the household accounts and Mrs. Trent's morning meetings and the calling hours and the charity committees, through the dinner parties and the evening dresses and the conversation that happened in the drawing room when the men had taken the port. through the children and the pregnancies and the complicated intimacy of shared daily life, through the law that was and the law that was slowly becoming something else, and the women who were making it change, and through Catherine, who was in the end the whole point. I hope you are somewhere soft. I hope the lights are low wherever you are, and that the weight of the day has lifted a little, and that the history we have travelled through together has given you something, not just information, but the quieter kind of knowing that comes from sitting inside someone else's world for a while and finding it human, recognisably and tenderly human, in spite of all the ways it differs from your own. The Victorian era is over. The rules are different now. The corsets are gone. The calling cards are gone. The legal doctrine that made a wife an extension of her husband is gone. What remains is the same thing that remained through all of it. People, trying, in the best way they knew, inside whatever structure the world handed them. Sleep well, friend. The lamp is out, the rain has stopped, the house is quiet,